This story will be about legends and legends. There are various fairy tales, heroic legends, northern bailarinas, epic poetry, tales, but all of them together are called legends and legends. And even if everyone wanted to be a part of it, few were willing to pay that price. This story was about a guy who looked like a black as pitch demon in that terrifying armor. Everyone who saw him called him the Blood Prince of the Clodo Empire. Once upon a time, people dreaded the legends and legends of the Peerless Knight. On the Clodo calendar was the 15th day, 4th month, 209th year. The enemy army of more than 1,000 men was already ready for battle. These were the covering troops. There were 300 rearguards against them, which were the remnants of completely defeated troops. But the young youth at the head of the army said that they had to do it. This young man was the 8th prince of Claude's empire named Leonard. Leo ordered the troops to hold back the enemy troops here. The lad thought it was necessary to let the main forces freely move forward. Some of the troops behind him were nervous. Leo gripped the blade in his hands tighter. He was afraid that here would be the last frontier if they didn't stop this inferno. All the troops behind the guy were shaking with fear and praying to the god of war Mars for salvation. They mentioned Ares and prayed to bless them with victory and give them strength. Standing next to the hero was the eldest son of the house of Idonia named Alan. Alan felt that today, indeed, it would be better for the hero to turn to the gods for help. Alan kissed his weapon and closed his eyes, asking Aaron to give him strength and show him the way to victory. Looking at him, Leo shouted that he would not do that. Alan thought that there was nothing wrong with that. Leo didn't even think that Alan would kiss his weapon in such a situation. He thought that Alan was more cold-blooded. Alan thought that was far from what he needed to worry about right now. Leo apologized to his friend. Suddenly, behind them, the whole army laughed and the boys looked at them questioningly. They thought it was funny that the two guys were talking as usual. Now they seemed like fools accepting defeat. Besides, as Alan said, they would follow the fearless His Majesty. The boys glanced among themselves. With a confident smile, Leo suggested that the lads do so. The hero never bowed to the gods because, in his opinion, usually the way to salvation was opened only by one's own strength. After the hero concentrated, he opened his eyes and looked forward with confidence. Alan shouted that the enemies were advancing, and their troops rushed into battle. Leo decided to attack the very first and broke away from the main formation. But Alan asked him to stop. The enemy that ran at him laughed and said it was a single suicide attack. In his opinion, such were called fools, but Leo did not listen to him. Without a drop of doubt, the hero dodged his sharp spear and pierced his enemy with his sword through the chest. Next in line, the lad deftly chopped off an arm and then half his body. Leo's eyes reflected only strength and cold-bloodedness. It seemed as if he had no fear. One of the enemy soldiers asked the young man not to get carried away and pointed a spear at him. But the boy was faster than his weapon. He rolled to the side and then attacked back. The hero decided not to stop for the sake of his irreplaceable comrades. With these thoughts, he chopped the soldier's body in half. The hero ordered his soldiers forward and exclaimed that he would not let them pass while he was still alive. All of his allies apparently became afraid of this guy themselves. Alan couldn't believe his eyes. A faint smirk flashed across his face. He called out to the people and ordered them to follow the Leo. The army gained morale and rushed into battle. During the battle, the hero ordered the flanks to be held and their enemies to close in. Right in the middle of the battle, when the hero struck the enemy's armor with his sword, his blade began to crack. When he disemboweled the soldier, his sword failed and shattered into 2 pieces. The enemy flying at him laughed and said he was unlucky. He thought he had a good chance and pointed his spear at the Leo. But to his surprise, Leo grabbed the point of the spear and stopped it right in front of his nose. The enemy was confused and didn't realize what kind of reflexes this guy had. Leo snatched the weapon out of the enemy's hands and threw the soldier backwards. While the enemy tried to stay on his feet, Leo pierced his chest with his spear, whereupon the weapon broke in half. The boy turned his head and noticed that several more enemies were flying at him. Alan called out to his friend and threw his spare sword into his hands. Leo caught the weapon skillfully and blocked the enemy's attack just in time. As always, Leo wanted to apologize to Alan, but Alan told him not to worry because they were friends. The boys ordered their soldiers not to stop and move forward, and not to hold back their strength. The enemy commander was angry and did not understand why their soldiers were slow, for they were the remnants of a defeated army, and there were at most 300 men. They were interested in this guy with a sword. With so many soldiers in the battle situation, they somehow still didn't retreat. It was hard to believe, but the Leo army was managing to push the enemy at Mal army. At some point, a horseman appeared behind Leo's army. He shouted to the guys that they had done a good job and had held out well until they arrived. The soldiers looked around and with smiles called out to Rosalie herself. The hero smiled just as much, happy that his aunt had come to their aid. A female knight on a white horse shouted that if they made it to here, they were only one step away from the course end. She ordered them to pursue the enemy, for here was the best turning point, and if they stood firm and fought to the end, they could all retreat alive. She raised her sword upward and said that this meaningful retreat would surely lead to a return. With her words, she instilled a fighting spirit in the rest of the soldiers. Alan had no doubt that Rosalie herself could boost the morale of the soldiers, and Leo was in complete agreement with him. They were now in the domain of Rosalie herself in Alexis lands. Despite the position, she should have been the first to retreat to the Curunda along with the main forces. Alan thought that Rosalie was no match for Leo. Earlier, Rosalie had told the hero that her vassals were dead, but she had carved them into her memory. Of course, that's why everyone perked up. Leo remembered that this woman had always trained and protected him, and now with these hands he was ready to protect his aunt and comrades. Thinking of this, the boy once again rushed into battle. He thought that if the main forces were able to retreat even by sacrificing them, they would be satisfied. The guy ordered the enemy to die, after which he disemboweled his body in front of his aunt. Rosalie had been silently watching the battle all this time. Looking at the lad from the side, she smiled proudly. The woman exclaimed that they had a little more time to endure and ordered the troops to move forward. Right during the battle, another horse came galloping toward the Rosalie. The rider called out to the woman and said that they had terrible news. It was a young girl named Shella. She looked quite frightened, but Rosalie did not understand why she had returned. Shella replied that the main force had been suddenly attacked. A formidable cavalry unit of artificial horsemen had broken through the beast trails. Rosalie cursed and gritted her teeth. This was clearly not part of their plans, so the woman should have turned back. She called out to Leo and said that she trusted the place to him for a while. Leo was too busy fighting for Togo to answer her, and the women rushed to the aid of the main squad. At some point, the guy in black armor stopped. In the battle, Alan called out to the Leo and asked him what they were going to do next. But since Auntie said she trusted him, they wouldn't dare to take another step back. The hero went to the attack again and ordered his troops to move forward. Rosalie was happy to see that the lad had grown up and become quite trustworthy. At the time when Leo was still a baby on Claude's calendar was the 7th month, the 198th year. A certain man spoke of a dead woman, and he was indeed accused. The 6th Empress was a commoner, but that was somehow not good in people's opinion. The men laughed and suggested that she was probably very good in bed. In the end, they were all of noble birth and it was impossible to imitate them. People were incredibly happy to learn that this woman had died. Leonardo was 5 years old at the time, and the boy mourned for his mother. The boy's tears were streaming as he looked at her coffin. Leo didn't understand why his mother had died. Besides, his father said that he was sick and that was why he couldn't attend his mother's funeral. People bawled at little Leonardo and whispered amongst themselves with smirks. They wished this litter to die as soon as possible too. One of the men laughed and offered to sing an imperial hymn to welcome the Clodo at such a joyous time. Out of desperation, the crying Leo closed his eyes and covered his ears with his hands so that he would not hear it. He begged for help, but no one heard him. But at that moment, the doors to the hall opened abruptly. The woman who had gone inside told the people that they were very noisy. She thought they were scum who apparently had not been taught good manners. Everyone in the room abruptly stopped talking and let the woman approach the coffin quietly in silence. The boy took his hands away from his ears when he realized that everyone was abruptly silent. He didn't understand at all what had happened. At this time, Rosalie approached the coffin of the Riza and with her hand on her heart, she apologized to her for not getting there in time. She gently passed her hand over the woman's coffin, after which she turned around and approached Leo. While Leo denied reality, Rosalie asked the boy to lift his face. Through tears, Leo looked at the scarred woman. Rosalie grinned and said with a smile that people had spoiled such a kind and handsome guy. Rosalie didn't recall his mother ever crying and said so to Leo. Leo pressed his lips together and looked at Rosalie in surprise. Indeed, when his mother was alive, she told the boy that it was impossible to despair. No matter how hard things were for him, he had to look forward. That is what his mother always told him. Remembering her, Leo shook his head sideways to discourage crying. He realized that there was no way he could spill the seed of sorrow and wipe the tears from his eyes. The woman praised Leo and stroked the boy's head. Rosalie got down on one knee to be on the same level with Leo, and said that she was the one who taught her these words. Rosalie smiled and said that everything was okay now that she was next to Leo. Rosalie wanted the hero to become a strong and kind person. Then Leo took one last look at his mother's coffin. Leo smiled and said that his mother had taught him these words. Rosalie warmly called out to Leo and asked him to keep up with her. From then on, Leo began to follow Rosalie and they left the palace hall together. Now he was not sad and happily followed Rosalie. He didn't have any allies in the imperial capital, so he had to at least protect his body by himself. That was exactly what the Rosalie kept telling him. She said that incomplete determination was unacceptable and hoped that Leo could handle it. Leo was confident in his abilities and agreed with his aunt. That was a good answer. In that case, the first thing she would do was to give him an important item to increase his defense. The woman handed the boy his first sword, which was too heavy for him. Leo could hardly hold it in his hands, and a shiver of tension ran through his body. Nevertheless, Leo was delighted and thanked his aunt for the gift. The woman brought the soldier to them and told him that when she couldn't be his partner, she would let him rely on her. The man didn't understand how he could be in this situation or why he was chosen. The woman asked Leo to study hard. The boy looked at the sword and thought he should have learned how to swing it first. The soldier called out to Rosalie and asked her to wait. Before he could ask a question, the woman replied to the rest of the soldiers that everyone was ready to go. The man realized he had no choice and looked at the little Leo. Leo's eyes lit up with delight. He called the soldier his teacher, which pleased the man. He fixed his hair haughtily and thought it wasn't so bad. Later, the hero, along with Rosalie, arrived by carriage at Auntie's estate. From this day forward, Alexis province became a second home for Leo. Leo was delighted with the local scenery, which was very beautiful. Their carriage drove past a cross lake that was illuminated by the bright sun. There was a blue lake, emerald trees, and clear skies. Rosalie also thought that the scenery here was magnificent. It was a big mistake to underestimate the simple rural province. Perhaps it was inferior to the imperial capital in great vastness and luxury. But the provincial capital, Alexis Lint, would not yield in this. The city was so bustling with life and the streets were full of people. The people here had sparkling eyes. Everyone was very lively, regardless of social status. There was no one here who despised him, and no one wanted to harm the hero. Leo liked the place very much and was absolutely delighted with it. His Majesty Leonard also improved in skill, and so the grown-ups should be ashamed. The child partner was also quite good with the sword. One of the soldiers remembered the time when he came to train from Idonia. Some time later during a duel, Leo met Alan and got to know him. In honor of their friendship, the boys punched each other's fists. But in spite of his mastery of weapons, Auntie made Leo study. She inundated him with a mountain of books and kept telling him that you can't be a stupid, unattractive guy without an education. The hero thought it was all natural and constantly read books even at night. Rosalie was proud of the fact that Leo studied quite hard. During the fight, the woman kept saying that Leo was still weak and he needed to take his stance properly. If he didn't, he would die instantly during the fight. Once Leo fell on his knees and thought that he still had a long way to go before his auntie. But he was not going to give up and asked to take the challenge one more time. Auntie replied that they would call it a day and talk to each other for a while. Leo smiled and agreed with her. After getting very drunk, the woman told him that when she got married, there was only a shack here. She recounted how she was in the back of the place and hiccuped loudly. She hoped the guy was listening to her and asked him a question. Someone thought it was horrible because Leo also joined her every day. Leo grinned and replied that it was fine, because here he could eat delicious stew from Uncle Mashu. Besides, he liked his aunt's stories. Rosalie, who had been drinking, recounted that they laughed at her, but she kept practicing with absolutely no concern for poverty. She vowed to make Alexis richer than the imperial capital and to make everyone around her envious. That was the true purpose of her life. The woman noticed that she was running out of booze and told her Uncle Mashu about it. Alexis was the hero's second home. That's exactly what Leo told Rosalie. After their time at the bar, the hero had to carry Rosalie on his back, but he was overjoyed. He could only thank Rosalie for all she had done for him. The tipsy but understanding woman opened her eyes and smiled. Rosalie told the guy that he stole her words of thanks. And then on Claude's calendar came the third month, the 208th year. The curtain of the year-long Hell War would subsequently open. Invasion of the Infernal Empire had become a regular custom about every 10 years. They were going to invade this country, starting from the province of Alexis, located in the northernmost territory of Claude's empire. Excluding the rear troops, the army of the Idmaz amounted to about 30,000 men. Against them, regular troops of a detachment of knights united with 10,000 mercenary troops. They had repelled their attacks 3 times in the past, and this was the 4th defensive war for the Rosalies. For Leonardo, this was a baptism of fire, so Auntie asked the boy to pack up. Leo, by all appearances, was fully prepared for battle. He looked back at Alan, whose horse was standing next to him. The riders smiled at each other, whereupon Rosalie raised her weapon upwards. The boy thought that his aunt had trained him in this martial art, and he wanted to use it for his aunt's sake. At this time Leonard did not know much yet. He did not know that this war would acquire a hellish situation. Rosalie led the troops behind her and ordered them to advance. Further events took place in the province of Alexis of the Northern Tract. On Claude's calendar was the 3rd month, the 208th year. On the way, Rosalie told Leo that he needed to know about favorable positions. This could be one of the main reasons for winning the war. Most of the land in their province of Alexis was covered with forests. It was a natural fortification. The enemies could not fully deploy their fighting positions. It was worth a glance at their sloppy column. For example, their sparse army could simply take up a position like a dense plug in the road. Rosalie exclaimed that they would all definitely survive and ordered the troops to attack. The hero tried to convince himself that all was well, for he had mastered the power, at least for his own defense. For his aunt's sake, he had sworn to this art of war, and he would do it. The hero's cavalry troop was about to meet its foot opponents. Leo ordered the Adam guests to approach if they chose to come to them. The guy was the very first to attack and exclaimed that there was no way they were giving Alexis up. He was able to scare his enemies so much that they moved to temporarily retreat. The soldiers turned to His Highness Leonardo and said that they thought his baptism of fire had been quite successful. In their opinion, Leo was able to kill 10 enemies, if not more. A soldier named Bauman laughed, but Leo asked them not to praise him. Still, the soldiers thought that the sight of His Highness cutting through the forward positions was simply marvelous. Bauman thought that Rosalie must have been proud of that guy's dash forward. Leo smirked and clenched his hand into a fist. 9 years from that day, he continued to swing a sword every day under his aunt's supervision. The soldiers believed that no one could become Leo's opponent. Rosalie was not surprised that all the soldiers were exhausted for fighting a hero. Alan smirked and told the guy that there were no longer any opponents for Leo among those soldiers. Leo was embarrassed and said that Alan was exaggerating. After a while, Shella showed up at their camp and called out to Rosalia herself. While the woman was putting on her helmet, she called out to the hero. Leo hurriedly approached his aunt. The aunt smirked and told him that it didn't matter how brave a man was, even if he was strong. She questioned the guy and asked if such a thing would fit with the invasion itself. Leo blushed and swallowed the lump in his throat. His look became sad and he thought that Auntie was right. His bravery had absolutely no effect on the crowd. At this moment, it didn't matter if there was one or not. Rosalie smiled and asked him to memorize the military strategies first. He had to learn the techniques of controlling the army while keeping the allies alive. And then, after going through that, he had to use his courage. Then he would realize when the moment was right. With those words, she pounded the guy's breastplate with her fist. Looking after his departing aunt, the lad thought that he still didn't realize it. Rosalie suggested that the squad discuss strategy and ordered everyone to gather in front of the chamber. Auntie did not overlook ways to teach the principles of the troops. They were now in Alexis province, where the woman had assembled an army of knights and soldiers. Rosalie gathered everyone around a large table and said that they were mostly assembled today and had done a good job. She thought that from the previous battle, they understood everything. Their troops were few in number, though enough to cross swords with the admaz. However, it was impossible to fight for 5 minutes at a time, as the numerical minority would begin to dwindle sooner. This was exactly the case. If one assessed the situation, they simply had a stalemate, so Rosalie preferred to still fight while under siege, relying on the fortress walls. Shella thought it was an active defensive war. Rosalie smirked and said that they would organize some elite units from the soldiers. The commanders would be people who knew this forest well. The few elite squads were the enemy's blind spot. In other words, they would attack from forest roads and beast trails that were not on the map. They would have to attack the wagon transport troops at the back of the formation. The wagon transport troops are the lifeline carrying supplies. Rosalie decided to test Leo's knowledge and asked what would work in this situation. The guy answered that the enemies will experience a lack of convoys and lose troop morale. Alan wanted to tell Rosalie that their troops were not enough, even without such roundabouts. Rosalie stared menacingly at the boy, and Alan apologized to her. Rosalie believed that their result would be seen at once and assured the soldiers of it. While the soldiers went to their places, Auntie called out to Leonardo. She told the boy that war was not only about attacking head-on, and he needed to remember this well. Leo agreed with Rosalie. Meanwhile, the admaz troops were somewhere in the woods nearby, and the back rows of troops were having a conversation. They were discussing how the advance unit had failed for some reason. Even though it was enemy territory, still this result was not good for them. Some of the soldiers laughed and said that they were definitely lurking. In addition, this time their fight was different from the previous time. They believed that Alexis would still go into the hands of their country. While they were talking, one of the soldiers heard some noise behind them and turned around. He saw Leo galloping on his horse in front of him, who ordered the troops to attack. Instantly, several carts of enemy provisions were lost. The enemies were cursing and couldn't understand where their opponents had come from. If this continued, they could lose. The Adma troops were losing a detachment of wagon transport troops. Their commander was furious and didn't understand what their soldiers were doing at this time. Their food supply had suffered greatly and they were now out of supplies, wine, and even horse fodder. It was hard for the tired, wounded soldiers to hear this. One of them couldn't take it anymore and exclaimed that he couldn't take it anymore. He did not want to starve to death on a frontier like this and was going to go back. Before leaving, he asked the guys to do whatever they wanted with the invasion. One of the soldiers called out to him and asked him to wait. This man was also about to leave with him, but the commander ordered them to stop and called them cowardly fools. Meanwhile, the soldiers told Rosalie that the enemy had lost morale and the offensive was going very sluggish. They did not even swing their swords to wipe out the number of troops to 10,000. Just like she said, everything was going according to her plan. If it was really like this, the boys believed that it would be over soon. On an empty stomach, even burrowing dogs became violent, and they should not let their guard down. Rosalie turned to the squad and asked them to listen to her. The diners under the Alexis roof refused to let the aggressive guests in, so they should have returned hungry to their homes. That night the soldiers under Rosalie laughed and rejoiced in their victory. On Claude's calendar it was the 6th month, the 208th year. Leo heard the soldiers talking, which alerted him. They were talking about not receiving the goods of support from the country. The soldiers laughed and assumed that they were late because of some oversight. One of the soldiers decided to ask His Highness Leo's opinion. Leo smiled and said that Auntie had put aside goods for at least 1 year, so they would be able to feed the Lint troops in case of defense. Leo thought that everything was fine, and such worries were also unnecessary, because they would surely win. The soldiers laughed and agreed with him. They were confident that the general was not making any missteps and Leo was completely on their side. Leo looked back at his aunt and thought about how their enemy could even be wished for. He thought his enemies should have retreated early, for they were clearly not worthy enemies of Rosalie. One of the soldiers placed a hand on His Highness' shoulder and congratulated him on their victory. His partner laughed and said it was too early for that. While the boys were having fun, Rosalie stepped aside. She received a message that apparently their ship had sunk again in mid-swim. This time their cargo had been attacked by bandits, so they should not have expected goods. The reporting officer thought their victory was clear. He also said that she would be sent a message as information came in. Rosalia agreed with him and asked to keep quiet about the case. Now the morale of their soldiers was high, but she was more worried than ever before. She had a kind of strange feeling of failure. Rosalie realized that if there was a battle with the Admas, Alexis troops would take the hit defending the country. Instead, they had to supply support goods from all over the country to Claude's empire, and fight at the same time. Rosalie feared that such incidents would happen again. Be that as it may, they had to find out the cause as soon as possible. On Claude's calendar was the 8th month of the 208th year. It had been 5 months since the war began. The soldiers reported to Rosalie that the relief goods had arrived. Rosalie rejoiced and exclaimed that they had finally waited for them. They received another 300 men. This was quite an impressive troop for inland transportation. Rosalie thanked all the soldiers for their efforts. A soldier came up to her with a letter. Rosalie was glad he was all right and took the letter in her hands. The soldier explained that he was entrusted with it from Alan's father herself, the Count and Idonia. Rosalie was furious when she opened the letter and read it. She called out to Leo and the others and ordered them to gather in the tent. When all the right soldiers were assembled, the woman was about to explain what the matter was. 4 court aristocrats pressured the lords of each province. They planned so that support goods would not reach Alexis under the guise of accidents. As Rosalie pondered this, Leo began to shake with anger. He jumped up from the table and questioned why they would do something like this. Besides, he didn't understand why the 4 court aristocrats had such authority. It is not an exaggeration to say that Claude's current empire was ruled by aristocrats. Now emperor is just a title losing its influence. In fact, the 4 court aristocrats were the main aristocrats of the empire, running the country behind the scenes. The current state of this country actually spoke to their authority and immense economic influence. As the guy just said, the vanguard aristocrats who got power would do anything to line their pockets. Shella exclaimed that even if that was the case, they were fighting for the sake of their homeland. The soldiers were in complete agreement with her and thought about the profits from the loss of their territory. Rosalie raised her head and sighed heavily. The woman said that she made Alexis so rich, therefore was a stake for their group. Until now, she was needed as a guard dog to protect the north. But the next time the Admaz invaded, she thought she would be old by now. She thought that the last time they would use them in the current war, defeat here was preferable. Surely these people were going to let them die here. Leo was furious listening to something like that. Rosalie thought it was unimportant and said that even dragged out to the worst, with the onset of winter, the war would be over. Maintaining logistics in the winter became difficult and it was unprofitable. It meant that the invasion army would be hit. The horses carried supplies and food. It moved rather slowly as the feet and roads were covered with snow. The amount of wood for making fires at night would be enormous. Rosalie smirked and said that they had done a foolish thing, but they also had enough now to get everything done. After a long conversation, Rosalie let the soldiers go and everyone left the chamber in silence. At that time, the woman reflected on the fact that she might have been alone. She thought the aristocrats and Alexis were complete scum. It was also hard for Leo to comprehend all the difficulties they were facing. For a while longer he stood silently outside the general's chamber. On Claude's calendar it was already the 12th month, the 208th year. The first decade had arrived. The hero gave all his strength to the battle, but did not understand why things had happened. Their enemy was reduced to 10,000 along with casualties and deserters. Rosalie was going to use this event to finish in one blow. She told her soldiers that they would not let them set foot on Alexis land again. Before the fall, all of the soldiers were sure this would happen and gained a strong fighting spirit. Leo also had no doubt that Alexis would win. One of the soldiers at the distribution noticed that their amount of food was decreasing from day to day, and asked the cook what was wrong. The soldier replied that everyone was being poured the same amount and asked to be more patient. The soldier then ordered his portion to be given to him and an argument broke out between them. The cook ordered the ugly nobleman to stop and come over to him if he was looking for a fight. The others approached them to see what the conflict was about. One of the men wasn't sure if they were all right. If this continued, they might have been defeated someday. He had no doubt that they could repeat the mistake of the Admaz, cutting through the enemies one by one. Leo kept asking himself one question. He did not understand why. Even with the onset of winter, their enemy did not retreat. Rosalie had said earlier that, even dragged out to the worst with the onset of winter, the war would be over. Leo assumed that Auntie had failed to calculate this or had simply underestimated their enemies. The enemy soldiers were full of fighting spirit and were constantly advancing. The enemies were about to cut Alexis' stabbing short. Their general ordered the formation of a temporary retreat, and believed that this land would surely become their domain. The present winter was creeping cold through the whole body, especially on the north side, where the cold was fierce. The enemies were sure that the Alexis troops did not think that they would end up fighting in such cold weather. It was hardly an advantage of the war either. The grandfather asked his grandson to show some patience. There was a reason to stay attentive on the other side. The man laughed and thought that there was probably an interesting spectacle going on there, for there was a war going on between the starving fighting dogs. The aristocrats that sat at the long table laughed. Later, the soldiers found out that the four-court aristocrats had reported everything to the enemy. They realized that their provisions would be exhausted in a few months. Leo was furious that they even went to this extent and pounded his fists on the table with all his might. These aristocrats used anything to trap them. He didn't understand the methods of the four-court aristocrats and told the others, "It is likely that the real enemies are the four-court aristocrats. They are the aristocrats of the empire who have gnawed holes in this country." The soldiers could not forgive them for this and could not understand how they dared to do it all with brazen behavior. Rosalie suggested that they stop. After all, it was also a course of military action. Nothing would change even if they cursed with words of offense and until they did what had to be done. She wanted to reinforce sending ambassadors to the other aristocrats and ask for their support. The four-court aristocrats had many partners, so Rosalie thought that they would make up some kind of demands in exchange. Rosalie could not let their enemies ruin her dear Alexis. The soldiers and the protagonist no longer remembered how much time had passed since they had fought. They had fought day after day, and a lot of blood had flowed since then. Despite everything, they fought on and had no intention of giving Alexis to their enemies. Their food was dwindling weekly and they were only eating the leftovers. The soldiers were losing morale and could not fight on an empty stomach. Eventually, they had to organize a temporary retreat. Some of the soldiers even cried over the empty food raft and admitted that they did not see any victory in it. Although they had a pretty good superiority, they were now suffering defeat after defeat. Leo couldn't believe his eyes. Their fragile army began to rapidly lose morale. In the next battle, Alexis' squad was going to stop the enemies at all costs, and by no means let them reach the Lint. Leo heard how the soldiers were going to evacuate people to the castle. They had a hopeless war of siege and their city began to be slowly destroyed. While defending their last castle, Rosalie ordered them to keep their weapons and go outside. She offered to show them the hidden strength of the people of Alexis and believed they could do it. The soldiers exclaimed that they would fight for Alexis all together. Rosalie was glad to hear such a response. The soldiers and the rest of the people realized that they could not stay only protected. They could not remain silent as their streets and homes were being taken away before their eyes. One of the men said that they had killed his son, and he was sure to deal with them with his own hands. In the eyes of the people of Alexis, Leo saw nothing but confidence and bravery. Leo was happy to see their fighting spirit. Everyone raised their weapons up and shouted that they would never give their enemies their Alexis. Every day Leo listened to people complaining about the lack of food and starving to death. The young men cried, but their parents asked them to be patient, because everyone also lacked food. Leo berated himself for not being able to do anything about the situation. One of the children was constantly crying over her mother who couldn't do anything. Rosalie approached the crying girl and asked her to take her part so she wouldn't bother her mother. Rosalie said she could put up with it for a while longer. The girl's mother did not want to take her food, but Rosalie insisted on it. The woman grinned and said that she could not turn her back on those living in Alexa and her spirit would not fall for something like this. The hero was moved as the little crying girl gave the piece of bread back to the Rosalie and exclaimed that she didn't need it either. She took the example of the Rosalie and said that she would not lose heart. Rosalie patted her on the head and asked her not to water the seeds of misfortune from now on. Leo remembered how she had once taught him these words and also stroked his head. Rosalia asked to still eat her piece so that she could protect her mother. The ante went on and the hero gave Rosalie a glance with a smile and pride. Eventually the fighting continued and the squad needed to find a sanitation team as soon as possible. The enemy was getting higher and higher and they needed to stop them. But some soldiers couldn't even stop the blood. Leo couldn't find any other words but to call it all hell. They still hadn't received any support. Rosalie realized that if it continued like this, it was useless. After all, everyone was afraid of the four-court aristocrats. Rosalie patiently gritted her teeth. She felt that they had no choice but to endure all of this for the sake of human survival. After making a difficult decision, the soldiers started killing horses for food. Everyone recalled the four-court aristocrats and thought that no doubt they would be retaliated against for this. The soldiers tearfully ate their own horses and begged for forgiveness. Leo touched his horse and gritted his teeth. The boy clenched his sword in his hands and wondered if they could take it. He looked into the eyes of his faithful steed and apologized to him. Tears watered the seed of misfortune. It was with these thoughts that Leo killed his horse and did not shed a tear. Leo and the soldiers thanked the horses for the food, after which they became quiet and laid down on the ground. Rosalie meanwhile tended to the sick and gave them fluids. One of the soldiers quietly said that he could not stand it any longer and knelt down. Choking on saliva, the man looked at his wounded sleeping comrade and was about to kill himself. He wanted to end this torment. Unable to bear it, the soldier screamed and swung his knife. A sudden scream made Alan and Leo jump up from their seats. The guys thought that the enemy had begun to advance on them and grabbed their weapons. Leo tried to realize what was going on and saw Rosalie. At that time, Auntie had already hugged the crying soldier who asked her for forgiveness. Rosalie also apologized for being completely helpless and making them think about difficult things. The boys watched Rosalie pull the knife out of the soldier's stomach. The soldier sobbed and said it was hell. He didn't realize how much longer this would go on, but Rosalie assured him that everything was okay and that it would all be over soon. On Claude's calendar, it was already the first day of the 4th month, the 209th year. Looking at the wounded, Rosalie said that they had to take the people out in the territory of the province of Kodanda in the west. If they don't do that, because of the situation, people will start eating other people. As victims, the people of the castle will not be able to see the former, especially because of the forced deprivation committed. They will not be able to solve the problem without sacrificing themselves. In this battle, Rosalie had to make the hard decision to leave Lint, the capital of the province. Rosalie ordered the remaining soldiers to hold the enemy here for 2 weeks, buying time for the population to withdraw. Leo could not believe that this was really happening and that Auntie was leaving her province to Alexis. Earlier she had dreamed of making Alexis richer than the imperial capital so that everyone around her would be envious. It was her life's goal. Guy remembered the day when he first arrived here and when this place became his home. Rosalie exclaimed that this was not the end, for the population of Alexis had survived. There was no time to look back now, and they had to look confidently toward their hope. The boys looked at their aunt in surprise that she still believed in the best. Leo clenched his fist and thought about hope. At that moment, one of the soldiers approached Rosalie. He told her that as Alexis men, They would follow her to the very end and trust her with their lives. In the soldiers, wounded, old men, and even children, Rosalie saw complete determination and lack of fear. Rosalie smiled proudly, unable to answer them. Leo could see the light was still on. The people here had sparkling eyes and were all quite animated. Leo had no doubt that the light of hope still held on, continuing to shine before his eyes. The light of hope shone as well as they did. With those words, all the soldiers raised their weapons upwards, and at that moment, the soul of Alexis was together with Rosalia. They believed that they would surely go forward to their hope. With the Adme army advancing, Alexis' troops abandoned Lintus, the provincial capital. The war-weary were retreating, and this terrible choice was terrifying. Rosalia ordered the group to keep the main force out at all costs, for their lives were joined. She tried to calm the army and told them that they had a little more to endure. Rosalie along with Leo fought with all their might against the enemies, not letting them pass forward. Auntie asked Leo to focus on the enemies in front of his eyes, and the boy replied that he understood her. Leo thought about the fact that Auntie's broad back was still in the distance from him. Once they dealt with the remnants of the enemy army, Rosalie ordered them to move forward. During a brief respite, one of the soldiers ran up to Rosalie and said that a new pursuit squad was heading this way. The enemy numbers consisted of 1,000 men, if not more. At the same moment, one of the soldiers came up to Rosalie's back and exclaimed that this was the end for Alexis and all of them. With these words, he was about to impale the body of Auntie already. Before Rosalie could look back at the soldier, Leo cut off the soldier's head in one fell swoop. Leo thought about how they would never destroy the light of their hope. He called out to his aunt and asked her to give the place to him and asked him to go ahead. The woman was silent for a while, but then asked Leonardo to listen to her carefully. She said that the general was of good reputation. In other words, killing allies is not a good thing, so at least she will die on her own orders. The woman exclaimed that she had her dead vassals carved into her memory. Leo remained silent in response and clenched his sword in his hand. He gathered his wits and exclaimed that he regretted nothing in this rotting war. Auntie smiled and said that this time they would make sure of it properly. From the day Auntie left, the hero had hope all the time. It gave him a chance to think about the purpose in his life and point the way. Auntie was the person that gave him that hope. It was the hope of both him and Alexis. For this reason, he was going to protect everyone even by changing this body. Leo called out to the squad and told them that they would stop the enemies on this narrow path. They still had a little more to escape from the Adme's army. Auntie told the squad that they had done a good job and held out well. It was certainly a meaningful retreat that would lead to a return. Shella soon returned and replied that they had terrible news. The main force had been suddenly attacked and a formidable cavalry troop of horsemen had crept through the beast trails. Then the woman turned back and entrusted the place to the Leo for a time. Now began their final battle to spin hope. Leo was getting rid of his opponents with fury that every time they came at him. Leo couldn't let down his aunt who said she trusted him. Auntie looked at Leo with pride and suggested that Shell hurry up. During the battle, Alan asked the hero what they would do. Leo could only lead his squad forward and fight side by side. He thought that they would definitely stop them at this place and then join the main force alive. With these thoughts, the guy cut down several enemies and stopped. Leo ordered their opponents to disappear and pointed his weapons in their direction. Looking at the enraged guy that destroyed so many people, the enemy soldiers started to fear him, but they were ordered not to retreat. In that case, the hero could only agree with their decision and do as they wished. Leo ordered to send him at least 1,000, even 2,000 men, which he would slaughter with his sword. Leo did not hesitate for a moment to cut off the heads of the nearest soldiers. The enemy general ordered them to act faster and looked back. Finally, their archery squad arrived. He pointed to the daredevil commander in the center and ordered them to fire on him at full power. The archers took the order and a hail of arrows rained down on Leo and his partner Alan. The boys stopped and ducked down for defense. Leo looked at the archers with anger and considered their plan. Alan warned the hero that there was an arrow in his leg, but the hero assured him it was fine. The commander ordered his archers to shoot and finish him off next time. Alan and his squad wanted to warn the Leo and feared for their commander, but Leo saw the arrows perfectly well, so he was not worried about it. The guy deftly dodged half of the arrows, and the others he was able to shoot down with the blade of his sword. The whole troop enthusiastically shouted Leo that it was awesome. The enemies could not believe that such a thing was really possible. The commander of the army ordered the archers to shoot at Leo once more. But Leo didn't wait for the third attack and threw himself into the battle. The guy broke through the first ranks of the troops and swooped down screaming at the soldiers. The wounded soldiers could not understand what was wrong with him. Leo was in a rage, chopping off the heads of his opponents and stabbing arrows right through their foreheads. Looking at Leo, the commander began to doubt that this guy was really human. Leo didn't stop in his tracks and exclaimed that they needed more hell. Drowning in the blood of the Adma troops, Leo believed that they also didn't want to pray. The terrified soldiers were dumbfounded, not risking to attack Leo first. Even his allies, and including the Alan, froze in confusion. A mad grin grinned on the face of the bloody young man, which finally finished off the enemy troops. Leo shouted with all his might and ordered the Adma troops to disappear from here as quickly as possible. The squad leader exclaimed that the guy was a real demon. The commander shouted that a real demon had appeared to them and demanded that the fools get out of the way. The squad was dumbfounded, not understanding why their commander had abruptly gone on the run. The commander ordered the troops to shut up, for no one could stand up to something like this. The rest of the soldiers followed his example and hurriedly ran away. Leo's soldiers thought they had succeeded, for they were able to be frightened by his majesty. But still, despite this, even Leo's allies were afraid of his appearance at the moment. Alan cautiously approached Leo and clapped him on the shoulder, saying that he had succeeded. Unlike the others, he wasn't afraid of him at all. Leo turned to the guy and smiled at him, after which they bumped each other's fists as usual. The troops came to their senses and said that they had indeed won and stopped them, but Leo thought that it wasn't over yet. The lad raised up his weapon and ordered them to hurry up to catch up with the main force. The squad dramatically raised their morale and rushed in pursuit. The hero mentally asked his aunt to wait for them a little longer, for they had stopped their enemy squad. On the way to his aunt, the boy believed that very soon this hell would already be over. Leo wanted to hurry up and exclaimed that very soon he would be near. When Leo's squad arrived, they saw a terrible sight. One of the soldiers called out to His Highness and said that they had been expecting them. Rosalie herself also had no doubt that they would join them. Leo called out to Roberto, who was apparently already dead. The whole army was defeated and lying on the ground. Alan exclaimed that it was terrible. Leo could not say anything and pressed his lips together. The man with the eye patch said that he hadn't seen the Adma's army. As expected from Rosalie herself, they managed to fight back. According to the soldier, the main forces of the enemy army took a short rest in that side. Alan called out to Leo, who ran forward and looked for his aunt. After apologizing to the soldiers, Leo shoved them aside and asked his aunt where she was. Suddenly someone from the squad recognized Leonardo's voice and called back. After apologizing, Leo began shoving the crowd aside and asked to pass. He called out to the aunt once more and said he was glad she was all right. But when Leo got to the Rosalie, he couldn't believe his eyes. Leo stared in horror at the auntie with an arrow in her chest that lay in Shella's lap. The woman was bleeding, yet smirking and saying she was fine. Shella was crying out of powerlessness to help her and Leo understood. The boy gritted his teeth, trying to contain his emotions. One of the soldiers bowed to Leo and apologized to him, for there was nothing they could do about her bleeding. All the soldiers began to realize that they no longer saw any other way but to watch her. The man who was standing next to Leo cried. Alan looked at Leo with sympathy, but the guy believed that it wasn't too late. He didn't understand what the other soldiers were saying and asked Alan to help carry his aunt. Alan's lips trembled. He was sad to see Leo in such a state. He understood his feelings perfectly well and told Leo so. Leo took his hands and reminded him that he had sworn an oath to Auntie. With his own hands, he had to protect her, so he had to help her in some way. Alan could not answer Leo anything and only looked at him sympathetically. Rosalie quietly called Leonardo and asked him to come to her. Leo immediately came to his senses and rushed to his aunt. Leo repeated several times that he was already here and held out his hand to her. Auntie smiled and said she was glad he was back. She believed he could do it. Leo clenched her hand and agreed with her without fail. Leo hoped to the last that they would heal her as soon as possible and they would all be together as they had been before. Rosalie's hand began to loosen in Leo's grasp and a shiver ran through her. The woman only apologized and said it was time for her to get out of here. Leo still didn't believe it, but Rosalie asked Leonardo to listen to her. She had hammered quite a few military strategies into him during this year. But from her point of view, that was still half of it. Nor was he to stop seriously practicing the art of war. She reminded him about the conversation when it was the right moment to realize that. She was sure the guy would manifest himself by becoming unequaled. From Auntie's point of view, he had only learned half of it, but he was already capable of defending himself. He was no longer a child, unable to live without Auntie's constant protection. Rosalie smiled back at Leo. She looked at the boy proudly and said she was glad she did. Leo couldn't hold back his tears and his eyes sparkled. Rosalie said that in that case he would lead the whole squad forward and was sure he could handle it. Now their troop was lost in darkness, but he would surely light the way to happiness. Leo agreed with her and promised to do so. Rosalie addressed the whole troop and asked them to trust this child from now on. The woman apologized for her selfishness, because earlier she had talked about them all coming home together. The troop cried out that this was absolutely not the case and she was wrong. They felt that they were the ones who needed to ask her for forgiveness. They continued to rely on her the whole time. In Alexis, for their sake she gave her all, and she always helped and encouraged them. One of the soldiers shouted that they had given nothing to the Rosalies, but the woman disagreed with them. She thought that relying on her lord was already gratitude. Rosalie coughed heavily herself and said that she wanted to look at the lint one last time. Leo had no choice but to accept this and agree. He gently lifted his aunt in his arms. The child that was with them cried bitterly when he saw Leo carrying Auntie away. His mother tried to calm him down and told him that his older brother was leaving here for lit. She tried to assure him that everything was fine. It was getting even harder for Leo to hear their tears. Leo stopped in front of the forest with Alan and the rest of the troop. Auntie raised her head to look at their scenery. The hero hoped she could see everything. Rosalie smiled and replied that she had a good view of everything. The woman was happy to see for the last time her beautiful capital that was reflected in her eyes. The hero remembered the very moment when his aunt took him to her place and showed him the beautiful view from above of her capital. Leo loved the view of his new home. The woman smiled and said that they were undoubtedly envious of her, for no fire of war would hide her treasure. As a child, Leo always told her that the place was very beautiful and warm. Leo cried and told Rosalie that this place was better than the capital of the empire. All this because this place was being created under her care. Leo began to remember all the happy moments of his childhood that he spent here with his aunt. Here she was showing the guy the view of the lint when Leo was still a baby and she was holding him in her arms. Rosalie admitted that she had a craving for mashu stew. Earlier she had told her boyfriend that when they went back they would eat a lot of cooked mashu stew. Leo through tears agreed with her and asked her to remember to invite him. At last she was able to see her capital city and remember many things. Rosalie grinned and said that she was visited by so many thoughts at once. According to her, a despicable woman like her would soon die. Leo cried like a child and didn't understand why she was despicable. He was always by her side and eager to follow her back. The hero exclaimed that he would keep her company anywhere. Rosalie grinned and said that at least she would die like her grandmother, so they should not have cried. But apparently it was useless. Earlier, she had asked and taught him that she shouldn't have watered down the family's misfortune. In that case, the hero promised that it was the last time. Rosalie asked lastly to become a man who could think, first of all, of the happiness of people. Rosalie extended her hand to the hero and said that he was not like this child. She didn't have time to touch the boy's face as her hand became exhausted and the woman's body went limp. Leo looked at her hand, marveling that she could defend her homeland with such a delicate hand. The hero could only agree with his aunt and listen to her final instructions. Rosalie asked him not to look back. As the boy squeezed her hand, he saw that her eyes began to slowly pale. Rosalie closed her eyes. All she could ask for was for Leo to be happy. Leo hugged his aunt and gently lowered her to the ground. Leo couldn't stop his tears from rolling down from his eyes. Leo screamed. Everyone else couldn't believe that their general was leaving either. Looking at their sad faces, the woman smiled and said that so far they had all followed her. She was very happy with them and thanked them for everything. Meanwhile, His Majesty received a report that Alexis' troops had suffered a crushing defeat. The 10,000-strong army was eventually reduced to 2,000, resulting in a fleeing escape into the cairn. They survived by feeding on the blood and flesh of their horses, and it was utterly disgusting. Moreover, the man commanding the army was the very pommel that surprised them. He was dressed in armor and covered in blood and corpse smell. He was like a demon. As for Rosalie, much to their regret, she fell in battle. As soon as the aristocrats heard about this, their mood immediately improved, whereupon they laughed loudly. A grandson suggested to his grandfather to give his nickname to a human half-breed that survived by feeding on the blood of humans, a survivor who carelessly abandoned his allies. Moreover, overcoming thirst and sipping the blood of humans. In that case, they decided to nickname Leo the Blood Prince. On the calendar of the Clodo came the first day, the 5th month of the 209th year. In the capital of the Clodo Empire, they noticed the prince, but did not understand why he was here. The people had already heard the report on the fact of Alexis. People were afraid to get close to him and didn't understand why he could walk so majestically. They were afraid, for they mistook him for a demon who had come to drink blood. Some of them also heard that he was a demon who wore human skin. Eventually their territory was invaded, but he survived by sipping people's blood. Therefore, they nicknamed him the Blood Prince. One of the young soldiers that walked beside Leo ordered this to stop, for they had heard everything. They obviously didn't know anything about His Highness. Alan also didn't understand why they believed such false rumors. Leo was a warrior who fought for the sake of their country. The people could not answer Alan, but began to squint in their direction with disdain and fear. Alan asked Leo not to worry about it too much, for they were talking utter nonsense. They thought it was hard for anyone to believe such a thing. Leo looked completely indifferent and asked them not to worry about it because he didn't care. At this moment, he only thought of his aunt who asked him to be happy with a smile on her face. After thinking about it, the boy told Alan that all his happiness was in Alexis. He remembered the battle together with his comrades and the people who were loyal to his aunt. The happiness of everyone breathing in the Alexis undoubtedly existed there. Alexis was a country that Auntie had built with love. Now the late Rosalie entrusted everything to him and said that Leo would light the path to happiness. He was to be a man who could think first of the happiness of the people. Thinking only of this, a faint smile appeared on Leo's face. The boys apologized to His Highness, but they didn't understand what he wanted to say. Leo replied that after returning alive from that war, they even now lived the same way. They were deprived of many things because of the war that started from Alexis' territory. Now they had many things that they could not get back, including the Rosalies. Leo replied that he had made up his mind from now on. Guy clenched his hand into a fist and said that no matter what he used, he would definitely take Alexis back. Alan wanted to make sure that Leo knew what he was talking about. But Leo understood everything perfectly well and knew that to do it alone was completely reckless. So he wanted to make sure the guys would follow him and ask them a question. For a while, Alan and the rest of the guys were dumbfounded. Alan smiled and said that still he was no match for him. A dark-haired young guy offered to do it. The other guy shouted that they would gladly accompany His Highness. Thus their small team gained a fighting spirit. They all raised their fists up and offered to bring Alexis back. Suddenly, someone called out to Alan and asked if he was here. Alan spotted a guy who was apparently from Idonia. The man replied that he had news about his father. Leo didn't understand what happened, for there was shock on Alan's face. Alan stepped aside and tried to come to his senses. He apologized and said that he got a message from his father. He had to hurry back to Idonia. Alan wanted to sincerely ask for Leo's forgiveness. After all, he had made a vow to him for his return. Alan gripped the reins tightly in his hands. The boy sat back on his horse and asked only to remember that he too was an Alexis knight and felt the same way. The land called Alexis was also an irreplaceable place for him. Therefore, he was willing to do his best to definitely help them. At parting, Leo smiled at him and thanked him for his support. Just like in the old days, the boys punched each other's fists. Alan galloped back to Idonia and Leo walked him with a smile on his face. Shella, who was watching them, blushed and said it was beautiful. Shella approached His Highness and raised her hand up. She asked for permission to help him get revenge. She too wanted to go back to Lint and to Alexis. At that moment, Shella remembered Rosalie's words. She talked about how she was a smart kid and she would be okay even when she was gone. She asked her not to waste this wisdom and use it for important people. Shella replied that it was primarily a request of Rosalie herself. Leo exclaimed that this went without saying, for everyone knew who Shella was. Auntie was the very first to look closely at the choice of the best among the maid of honor from all over Claude's country. Auntie noticed the intelligence of the sent-down child. In fact, the hero was encouraged that she wanted to stay with them. Leo would like to know the ways, and the Shella replied to His Highness that he was. Shella put her hand on her chest and said she had a plan. Meanwhile, somewhere in the Lintu, a certain person brought the men weapons, but they thought it was a joke. They were going to get these weapons and pay at the end of the case. Since the young girl was allowing this, she was undoubtedly hiding something behind such a fine offer. The girl replied that this was absolutely not the case. She constantly thought that a person working in sweat at such a time was a chump, but a person living amusingly in a bandit's business was a winner. Serving up to important people taking full advantage of money was clearly not so pleasant. Soulmates feeling anger were easier to get together, so she wanted to be a support for all of them. People were starting to assume that they would suddenly get rich, and the girl smirked. She found it interesting that the current imperial troops were not at all scary to the locals. The men looked amongst themselves and exclaimed that it was undoubtedly true. One of the men that stood in the middle of the people asked why the girl was so kind to report this. The mysterious hooded girl replied that she was an arms dealer and they could make a profit for her. One way or another, it could be said that making profit was her profession. The people laughed and exclaimed that they liked it. She was truly a lad's girl, but that didn't matter now. They were in agreement with everything she said. One of the guys gathered his weapon and clapped her on the shoulder. He replied that he was in business as there was no thanks from this rotten country. The man asked her to just wait until they had done their business and returned her money. The girl smirked and said she would hope so. Further events took place in Claude's empire, the capital of the Kraken Empire. Here was the mansion of Alexis Province's domain. When all were assembled, the hero offered to listen to the musings of the Shella. After the conquest of Alexis Province, the invasion of the Admen army stopped. The re-invasion, by her calculations, would come in 5 years. Even if they took over the land, the hero believed that there would be a similar strike. Shella believed that their empire would not act to reclaim Alexis. Alexis was the personal territory of Rosalie herself with a strong character. Therefore, Claude's dignity was compromised, and considering such a thing, as long as it was not a loyal person, none of the noble families of the empire would act. However, just as Shella said, they were raring to line their pockets. Especially, investing in private troops and property for the sake of reclaiming Alexis was clearly not something they were going to do. The current emperor was also not of a firm character. He couldn't order them to go and take everything back, even while causing protests from the nobles. Everyone was silent for a while, carefully considering their plans. One of the young boys raised his hand and reminded them that the re-invasion of the Admaz would be in 5 years, which meant that the nobles could not watch and wait. The noble families of the empire would only have to unite to fight. Then they would take part in destroying the Admaz by killing the enemies. By moving in waves they will be able to reclaim the Alexis. Like Bauman said, it was unfortunate, but they had no other choice. But Shella interrupted their conversation and said that they could not win. Shella was sure that in 5 years the Admaz would destroy the Claude. Because of her confident statement, the table became quite noisy. Everyone began to discuss it vigorously, and Leo couldn't believe she was saying it seriously. Bauman believed that Rosalie herself had also passed away because the Admaz were formidable enemies. Also they knew the Gazara, but the Clodo was a big country. Even if the country was in turmoil now because of aristocrats acting in their own interests, he was sure they would wake up if they were backed into a corner. If they united with the whole country, there would be no fear of enemies like the Admaz. Everyone else supported Bauman's word and said that their country was still not weakened. The problem was that there was unrest in that country. In recent years, bandits in all of Clodo's territories had been acting brazenly. There were rumored to be provinces where popular uprisings broke out. The lords of each province have heavily taxed the people, while the military budget has been cut slightly with no concern for public safety. This way of acting of the corrupt nobles was becoming an indirect cause causing the people's rebellion and the household of bandits. Nevertheless, Rosalie herself was worried during her lifetime, thinking that there were people inciting them and being the direct cause. It was conceivable that the Admaz were pulling strings in this way from the outside. Shella did not deny it and said that there was a high probability. But perhaps there was something greater acting from the outside and she could not deny even that possibility. It happened too often. Shella walked over to Leo and gave him the letter. The hero unfolded the letter and was surprised to see his aunt's handwriting there. The fact is that Rosalie herself had been following this for a long time. According to her information, there was indeed a growing risk of the destruction of the place in 4 years. Also, after reading the history, few countries were destroyed from outside. It was called internal turmoil and outside pressure. Usually a state was attacked and destroyed when resistance was lost due to turmoil in the country. For 5 years, the Admaz would sharpen their fangs and Claude would be in dire straits. Under those conditions, they would not be able to win against them. One of the men looked at the scribbles from the notepad and thought the point was getting through without him. The guy sitting next to him couldn't argue with him. The hero sighed heavily and said their conversation began to escalate. It needed to be summarized in order to get Alexis back. First, they must save Claude from the path of perdition. Shella agreed with Leo and said that His Highness was right. One of the soldiers told Shella that it was easier said than done. He doubted that there was any way they could have dealt with the inner turmoil of the Gazaru. At that moment, the words that the aristocrats had said to him flew through the hero's mind. They wished for his speedy death and also laughed that they were blamed for the woman's death. Earlier, Rosalie had warned them that the four-court aristocrats were denouncing everything to the enemy. She also asked the boy not to look back, and those were the last words. Leo said that even demanding prudence from this group, 5 years was not enough to change things. Of course, there was a way to deal with the aristocrats, but neither Shell nor Leo thought of anything. But Shella thought they could do something about the population. The current situation in this country was because of the nobles' willfulness, which was quickly losing the public's sympathy. In that case, if they regained the public's sympathy, it could help them. Leo thought that even they didn't realize how much the hearts of the people were hurting. Leo looked questioningly at Shella, who for some reason became silent and blushed. No one understood what had happened to her. The Shella seemed to be experiencing excitement. She looked pitifully at Leo and asked her not to laugh when they heard it. The hero realized that she was still a very young girl as she spoke in such eloquence. He assured her that he would not laugh at her, and the Shella coughed. Shella suddenly asked Leo to be a hero, but Leo had absolutely no idea what she meant. She was clearly talking about people called heroes for their accomplishments. She suggested to try to become a hero in this place, which would hold and keep the hearts of the people. But the hero did not understand how he could do that. In response, Shella smiled and winked at them. She reminded His Highness of the legends and lore. The soldiers along with the boy were dumbfounded, looking at the girl in surprise. She spoke for oral traditions, stories, myths, funny stories, tales of heroes, northern bailinas, epic poetry, and fairy tales. There was variety in the names, but their common name was legends and tales. The hero seriously thought about legends and legends. People are realized by professions such as actors in plays and bards in the world. People asked for it and were even willing to pay. Unlike food and sleep, people did not die without getting them. Despite this, people couldn't help but ask for it. Shella asked not to think it was a very strong native desire, and the guy thought it really made sense. For example, His Highness was not a different person. He had a nickname attached to him such as the Blood Prince. He was dramatized by the fact that he survived by drinking people's blood. This story spread well from people's mouths. Now everyone in the imperial capital thought of His Highness as a terrible and cruel person, even though no one knew what His Highness was really like. Still, that was the real power of legends and lore. Shella raised her fist upwards and exclaimed that they would do the opposite, carrying their own hope to those who would rise up to save this country, Leo, to someday deal with the Admas. They needed to create a legend by making a story about such a real hero. They spread it as a legend and people would just hear it and want to rally under the banner of this hero. Plus, it was very exciting. If they succeeded and it happened, then they could get Alexis back. Shella was sure that they would definitely succeed. Leo didn't even understand the argument and looked at Shella questioningly. The girl abruptly moved closer to his face and exclaimed that if it was His Highness, then they would succeed. Or rather, this role could only be played by an actor named His Highness. Rosalie Sama's nephew, the well-trained and morally influential His Highness, rose up to avenge Rosalie Sama. Shella again turned sharply away from Leo and exclaimed that His Highness had suffered a crushing defeat at Alexis, and was returning to retrieve Alexis. And above all, His Highness is truly a hero with magnificent courage. Shella wanted to hear the opinions of the others and turned to the gentleman. If only all this is gathered, the people will see the truth in the legends and lore. The boys agreed with her and raised their hands in the air. The hero thought that one could count on such a thing, but still one should not trust it completely. Before he could finish his sentence, Shella exclaimed that they would succeed. He had to be sure of that. Shella was sure of it, for His Highness was her ideal person. Everyone, including the embarrassed Leo, stared at Shella and there was an awkward pause in the hall. Shella blushed as she realized that she had said something unnecessary. Bauman chuckled, saying that Shella's ideal man is His Highness. Shella tried to justify herself and explain that she meant something completely different. She meant that it matched her concept to the last, and it was in no way a relationship between a man and a woman. Everyone just chuckled and looked at Shella with a rather understanding look. Leo asked her to calm down, for they already understood her. But Shella didn't think they understood her. Leo asked what she meant, but the girl waved off the answer. Still, Bauman was really in agreement with Shella's words. Shella had a terrible observation that was to his liking. All the other soldiers supported Bauman. The whole table shouted in the direction of His Highness and offered to do so. Leo asked the people to slow down a bit. If they could really get Alexis back, he could do anything. But pretending to be an idol didn't feel right to him. Bauman felt that if the guy had the determination, he should have tried everything. Bauman asked Shella where best to start, specifically to regain the public's sympathy for the sake of legends and lore. Shella suggested suppressing the bandits in each region to start. Bauman exclaimed that this way they would kill two birds with one stone. Leo smiled approvingly toward the Shella. If their affairs were like this, a squad of Alexis and Leo's knights was quite enough. Hence, if they cleaned up a bit of internal turmoil, they would be better prepared for the war with the Admas in 5 years. That way, they would be able to help the people in need. Even that alone would be of some benefit. Leo clenched his hands into a fist and exclaimed that this was excellent. He decided to ask the emperor to issue an imperial decree tomorrow. Leo proposed to regain the public's sympathy through legends and lore. Everyone supported him with cheers and rose to their feet and raised their hands in the air. Leo looked at his team with a smile and thought that one day they would definitely win back Alexis. Shella made a suggestion of legends and lore. They could regain the public's sympathy through them. Leonardo's squad came forward to reclaim Alexis. The bandits nesting in every region were endless, as corroboration of the Shella's words. The masses feared the bandits and suffered from the difference in status. This discontent created an even more vicious circle. Then, 2 years later, the 211th year came on Claude's calendar. The province of Jan was no exception either. Looking at all the spoils, the man felt that it was not enough, and he was not at all satisfied with it. The bandit with the skull and cross pendant told his troop that they would go to the Deek Mountains and take more booty there. Everyone supported him with loud cheers. With the change of the current lord, life became more and more difficult. All the people were talking about the tax being raised again this year. It seems that the trade caravan was attacked on the western highway for the 3rd time this month. It became quite hectic in this city, but despite that, some people even managed to sell flowers around the city. Some were afraid to talk about it, for they might be heard by the officials. The people marveled at a girl named Lori that smiled constantly even in such a situation and sold flowers. She asked passersby to take one flower and remember to smile, even at such a time. A family of locals also asked the girl not to forget that smile. As Lori was walking further, she was called out by a certain man. The nasty pot-bellied bandit licked his lips and offered the girl to play with them instead of her flowers. The girl's basket of flowers abruptly ended up on the ground. The man tipped the girl over to his shoulder and ordered the others to take everything of value and kill anyone who resisted. Under his orders, they could kill even women and children without hesitation. The locals didn't understand what happened to the regular soldiers, but it was rumored that their current lord had reduced them. The locals could no longer let the bandits do what they wanted and decided to confront them. Some children lost their parents and some had their daughter and home taken from them. The locals wept and cursed Count Zhang. While they suffered, he indulged in luxuries without doing anything for the people. If such a thing happened, the residents wanted to get rid of the arrogant nobles. The armorer girl that gave the weapons to the bandits smirked. After overhearing the conversation of the villagers, she thought that it was only a matter of time. It seemed great to her that the anger inside was increasing day by day. The empress, who was sniffing around secretly, was also progressing well. Now she was finished, and the duke was happy too. During the raid of the bandits, their leader amused himself with the girl that could even resist him. He liked that she fought him back and looked like a real woman. He rolled the bound girl over on her stomach and invited the guys to bet how strong this woman was. Looking at the slaughtered locals, tears flowed from her eyes. But no matter what, she tried not to forget that smile. While one of the bandits was in public, their leader grinned and asked what was wrong. She had been frisky recently, but now something had happened to her. Some of the rebellious men looked at the leader with displeased faces. They did not want to do something like that and apologized for it. The leader offered to be like the fool who rebuked him for it and was left without limbs if they were displeased about something. The frightened residents that ended up becoming bandits decided not to argue with him. In that case, the boss suggested that the guys watch as the stakes were raised. One of the men raised his hand and apologized to the boss. The leader suggested that he wanted to place his bet and asked how much he would bet. The man replied that that was not why he was here. He had heard conversations in the town they had attacked today. The leader ordered him to speak further. One of the dying locals said that their atrocity would soon be over. It looked like a squad of knights for pacification from the imperial capital on behalf of the cowardly lord was approaching. The leader grinned and said that he had heard this talk as well. He assumed that their partner had chickened out. The boss exclaimed that not only Count Zhang, but the imperial troops were full of cowards. In fact, when Alexis was taken from them, in response they waved their hands and did nothing. It was said that even in the knights unit, there were no more than 200 men, and they had 400, so they were not their opponents. Yet one of the bandits said that they were led by a bloody prince who was a very violent guy. The leader laughed at the top of his voice and said that he was the representative of the coward that was recently talked about. He had lost to the Admaz. Moreover, he had survived by feeding on the blood of his comrades. This was a man who stood up against the wind. Rumor had it that he went around and subdued bandits in various places. It was also rumored that when he fought the enemy, he always interrupted them all. Someone present stopped him and said that this conversation was quite different from what he had heard from him. The leader picked his nose with a smirk and said that it was just rumors. He thought that these facts were rather exaggerated. He was angry that each of his boys took it as truth. With a disgruntled look, he took the contents out of his nose and defiantly threw it at the man. After that, he walked over to the exhausted girl and lifted her up by her hair. He licked his face and said that she was already useless. The leader was ready to fight. It didn't really matter much to him if everyone agreed with what was known. The leader invited the Blood Prince to come if he still dared to come here. He raised his knife and said that he was different from the bandit in every way. Meanwhile, the bowman smiled at his highness and put his black helmet in his hands. Leo silently took it in his hands and walked over to his horse. The hero stood beside his faithful horse Zanzas and asked him to calm down. With these words, he leisurely put his helmet on his head. Before leaving, Leo wanted to make sure that everyone was well prepared. The guy turned to the squad and ordered them to perform. Bauman and the others were full of fighting spirit and agreed with Leo. During this time, the bandit leader managed to mutilate the girl's face. He cut off half of her cheek and also gouged out her eye. Her severed head stood on the shelf of the ruined house like a trophy. While the boss was drinking, the rest of the bandits informed him that knights had indeed shown up from the sentries at the foot of the hill. The bandits smirked, clearly pleased that they had finally arrived. The boss ordered his boys to take their weapons and wait for them in the middle of the mountain as they had planned. He offered to show these cowards the forgotten themselves. He ordered to show the knights where their real place was. While they were waiting for the knights to arrive, one of the bandits asked a question. He suggested that he should have waited for them to come up to the hideout. The leader laughed and said that was why his head was weak. He didn't even have to tell them that he had anticipated their actions. The cavalry prided themselves on their strength to break through by using horses. Still, their horses were surprisingly strong, but if they continued to climb the slopes with all their might, they would be exhausted immediately. Demonstrating a proud breakthrough force, not to mention the baggage, the bandit leader thought they would attack on foot. The knights wrapped in armor prided themselves on their defensive ability. However, they would not be able to climb the mountain wearing heavy armor. Even if they succeeded from the start of the battle, they would be knocked out, so they would probably attack in light equipment. They must have finished secretly checking their strongholds, but climbing up so far they will take a breather, preparing a formation to cut them out in one go. This middle of the mountain was a bit wide, so they ambushed the exhausted squad of knights to kill them all at once. The leader praised himself and said it was an effective plan based on his thinking and experience. He asked the boys not to think that their head of the large mob had nothing but muscle. The bandits laughed in response. The leader thought it would soon be a good time for their climb up to this place. The side with superior strength would win the battle. They would have to all strike each other at the same time and the enemy would retreat. The leader raised his weapon up and offered to show them how scary the real brigands were. It was evident from the people that this did not appeal to them at all. They did not have the very fighting spirit of the brigand in them. One of the men mentally asked himself to wait and not to become such a fool that he himself would become a wannabe brigand. Earlier there had been quarrels in the man's family. The man ordered him to let him go, for his mother did not understand anything. They worked hard without sparing themselves, but still everything was taken away by the nobles. They did not even have proper food, and they were not even sent a doctor. Eventually, she began to look like her father, and if this continued, soon there might not even be a mother. The mother slapped her son and asked him to stop it. She was doubly hurt that she had to slap him. She grabbed the boy by his clothes and told him it wasn't too late to back off. The mother hoped that Delro would not do that. The crying mother knelt in front of him, but the man said they had no other way. He couldn't afford to lose his mother as well. At that time the Delro found himself under a leader who laughed and ordered him not to hesitate and finish the man off. The frightened rich man asked them to stop and begged them to take his rotten money. He wanted to give them everything just to keep him alive. The rich man offered to imagine how many things he could buy food to his heart's content, and even a woman. Delro took the sack and immediately thought of his mother. While he was in thought, the man had something on his mind and reached into his pocket with a smirk. He pulled out a knife and stabbed the Delro right in the eye while he let his guard down. The rich man laughed and asked him not to underestimate him. The nobleman exclaimed that also someone like him eating stinking food all his life could stay alive. He considered all of them as inferior people. The boss thought that the Delro had turned out to be a complete moron. The nobleman exclaimed that he and his family were stupidly crawling around on the ground and dying. The leader called out to the lad and asked if he was really as much of a coward as these nobles. Delro exclaimed that he was different and pounced on the nobleman. Delro looked sadly at the dead nobleman and thought that they just wanted to get money from rich people just to eat. The leader smugly called out to the rest of the group. The leader licked the blade of his sword and asked if they regretted their journey. They were all guilty enough people and nothing but beheading awaited them there. People didn't understand how he could fill them with fighting spirit through threats. The bandits ended up waiting for the Leo squad for an hour. The leader couldn't stand it and asked what they were doing there. He didn't understand why it took them so long with grown men's legs to get there. The city men obviously didn't get enough exercise, but either way he was sure they spent their lives swimming in warm water and comfort. Suddenly, one of the boys shouted that he saw a squad of knights. The leader was glad that they had finally shown up. He thought it was useless to wait for them and they should have struck first. It seemed to the young bandit that they had a problem. It was as if they had come up to them on foot. The leader and the others didn't understand what was wrong and tried to look closely into the distance of the forest to see their opponents. The heads of the horses could faintly be seen from the forest. Leo, who was walking beside his four-legged partner, smirked. The bandit was surprised and did not expect Leo's horse to be riderless. The bandits warned the boss that a squad of Alexis knights was already here. He had to say that he foresaw the action of the knights and an effective plan based on his thinking and experience. But the leader in no way expected the knights to independently ride up to them with their horses. The troop of knights deliberately went up by leading the reins of the horses so that the animals would not be exhausted. In addition, the leading man and that horse were wearing heavy armor with a helmet, and they all climbed up to this place. The bandit leader couldn't believe his eyes. In the first place, such endurance was amazing, but the leader didn't understand what the squad of knights was thinking. Earlier, Shella had offered them a pretty good plan to use the horses. It looked like they were right. Bauman looked at Leo with a smile. As expected of his highness, his breath didn't even hitch. Leo smirked and said that it was also the result of tireless tempering. This was exactly what his aunt had bequeathed to him. With those words, the hero climbed on top of his horse. When the whole troop had mounted their horses, Leo ordered them to go on the attack. A confused Delro called out to their leader. The leader ordered him to calm down and shut up. He said that it was only a little out of line with their expectations. The leader felt that they shouldn't have bowed out, because it would all be over if they showed weakness. Yet this was completely different from what they had heard. They had heard that the Imperial troops were nothing but cowards, but this monster at the head was clearly a blood prince. Bauman shouted that the god of war was watching them everywhere in this world. Spurring his horse, Leo ordered the entire troop to move to the attack and the cavalry rushed after his highness. The head of the bandits still doubted them, but the knights were getting closer. They conducted a real cavalry attack in the mountains, which was unthinkable. The knights ordered everyone who cared about their lives to surrender. The head ordered his boys not to run away and threatened to kill them. Bauman had no doubt that these men had too many reasons why they were acting against their will. If so, they were willing to listen to their story and allow them to recover by accepting punishment in accordance with the crime. He ordered them to drop their weapons immediately. Delro pronounced that even for them there was still a way of salvation and threw down his weapon. All the men followed his example and threw their weapons on the ground. The leader of the bandits remembered why he was sure of his victory. Definitely it was that man's fault. He was deceived by that girl who brought them a pile of weapons. The man clenched his fist with rage and gritted his teeth. He ordered the fleeing boys to stop and wounded one of the fugitives with his sword. Leo noticed the boss grabbing a frightened Delro by his clothes and holding a knife to his face. He ordered them not to think about the fact that they could return to a decent life. As he told them, it was too late for regret. Delro could only choose to die by his hand. The boss tossed the terrified boy and ordered him to keep following him if he didn't want to die here. Tears of despair came to Delro's eyes. Everyone else and the Delro grabbed their weapons and through tears ran at the enemy. The head of the bandits ordered them not to coward and attack them at full strength. Leo called out his four-legged friend Zanzas and swung his weapon. He asked his horse to lead the way and aimed at the Delro. The frightened Delro covered his eyes, but only noticed Leo's stick passing near his nose. Leo managed to knock the sword out of the guy's hands without even injuring him. The slightly wounded men began to fall to the ground as Leo disarmed them. On his way he did this to all the people, trying not to kill them. The bandit leader didn't realize what kind of guy he was. The leader was furious and exclaimed that they would not kill them with some stick. He ordered them not to underestimate all the bandits around them. In the end, the head realized that he would not be able to take his life with an ordinary stick. The head saw this as a fatal weakness in the young man and swung at him with his sword. As he approached his enemy, Leo donned his helmet. The bandit leader ordered the hero to die, but Leo was faster than his weapon and dealt him a crushing blow. The Blood Prince's blow was so powerful that it cut the bandit's face in half and gouged out his eye. Eventually, after dealing with their ringleader, all the other bandits surrendered. Leo replied that the crimes they had committed should never be forgiven, and they would have to atone for it with their bodies. It looked like the Blood Prince was a very violent guy. There was a rumor that when he fought the enemy, he always interrupted everyone. Delro remembered the words of the gang leader. He thought they were guilty enough men and nothing but beheading awaited them. With tears in his eyes, the man remembered how his mother had asked him to give up this path. Now he could only mentally ask her for forgiveness. Delro lowered his head and, washing his tears away, asked his mother for forgiveness. But to their surprise, Leo ordered them to move on. People who had already given up hope stared at Leo in shock. Leo speculated that they might not be able to wash the blood off their stained hands anymore. However, for this reason, they had to live desperately as people whose lives were taken away by their own hands. They had to live recognizing the crimes and were bound to recover. After that, they had to move on the right path. There was still a light burning in their eyes by which they could move forward towards hope. With these words, Leo ducked down to Delro and lowered his hand on him. Holding out his hand to them in his black armor, Leo smiled and said that he would create that hope for them. The men burst into tears even louder and happily agreed to follow their new light. The hero asked his soldiers to take care of each person from now on. The soldier asked His Highness to be careful on the way back, but the hero knew that Bauman wanted them to tell people in other places about the Leo. Delro looked after the departing Blood Prince and called out to him. He addressed him not as the Blood Prince, but as His Highness Leonardo. They bowed to him and thanked him sincerely for the helping hand he had extended to them. They would not forget this kindness for the rest of their lives and would earnestly endeavor to serve their sentence. Leo looked at the penitent faces of the people that thanked endlessly and shed their tears. Leo smiled at them and agreed to their proposal. The arms dealer that had previously been in contact with the bandits was discreetly eavesdropping on them in the forest. She was extremely unhappy about the situation. She came to see the situation and didn't understand what Leo was using. She saw Leo's squad cut off the heads of the bandits and took them with them. It was like the Blood Prince from the rumors had an astounding strategy. Each mountain of Jan province forms a chain. Storming with cavalry was better after fully understanding the mountain topography. They may have taken small breaks so as not to exhaust the horses during the assault, so it took longer to reach this place. At the very least, he would not have attacked until the last moment, saving the horses' legs for the onset of the battle. Furthermore, the Blood Prince himself was like a monster, along with that physical strength, attack, and defense. He suicidally paved the way. The girl didn't expect the man to retreat at all with such martial prowess and such a sinister appearance. Fortunately, those who escaped his attack were defeated by the knights attacking from behind. They swiftly struck at the enemy ringleader and made him lose his morale until he was completely defeated. The strategy was only possible because of the complete trust in the Blood Prince. The strategist who came up with this tactic was a true schemer, or the girl thought that the proper head lacked common sense. Without knowing it, she was talking specifically about the shell, in which case she had no choice but to leave the place. He was only the first part of their plan, so she had to report it. The girl didn't want to disturb in the middle of it, especially when it came to him. The girl grinned and thought that the moment had arrived. As Leo's squad headed back, Bauman grinned and said that this time the strategist Dono's idea was stunning. As expected, although they were still young, His Highness and the strategist were already quite good. Especially they were brave enough to suppress enemies with the Gazaru stick. They too had to focus on their training. The man said that Leo had really grown up. Rosalie herself died and the number of mouths decreased. For 2 years he developed tactics and military skills to begin to subdue the bandits. The bandits only attacked the weak and never fought on the front lines. In the end, they could not imitate them. No one doubted that Rosalie herself would have been pleased as well. The hero understood everything perfectly well, so he asked Bauman to stop it. But Bauman felt that he shouldn't have been modest. Also, they needed to tell everyone about his current bravery. The young earl who supported their military expenditure was also looking forward to it. Indeed, Alan also fought alongside His Majesty. It couldn't be helped that he was sick at the present time. In any case, things would be different now. Leo looked at the birds in the sky with a smile. Now the people of Jean province could calm down. At last Delro could see his mother and hug her. Leo, meanwhile, visited Rosalie's grave and brought her flowers. Now that the hero had arrived in the province of Jan of Claude's capital, he was welcomed as never before. Everyone gathered in the main street to greet the prince. Children rushed to the main street to see the prince, and the girls were crazy about his appearance. This troop of knights was beautiful to them. Everyone knew that the Blood Prince's squad had completely subdued the bandits. They were grateful to them for saving the province, and some people asked to look in their direction. Previously, from the talk about the Blood Prince, they thought he was a horrible person. They completely failed to see a man who escaped into one, sacrificing allies and losing to the Idmaz. Looking at his majestic face, the girls thought that mere rumors could not be trusted. Some men suggested that his nickname was feared by the enemy. They were delighted that the Lord did go around and subdue bandits in every region. Some of them knew from the beginning that Leo was a real hero. Listening to such talk, a shiver ran through the hero and his face turned red. Shella grinned when she saw the expression on Leo's face. Shella asked him to behave more dignified. After all, he was a hero. She asked him to remind His Highness of the legends and lore. The guy blushed even more and asked the strategist to at least not laugh. Shella blushed herself and asked to be called by her name. The girl turned away and admitted that she didn't like being called so formally. Leo smiled at her. He confessed that he actually felt his powerlessness, but nevertheless everyone trusted him and followed him. He once again realized the greatness of Auntie, and thought that she carried with all her heart a pressure stronger than this. But that was why they had to become stronger and perk up their spirits. If he didn't give up, every difficult thing would be realized someday. If one didn't believe that, their lives had no meaning. The hero remembered all the comrades, Auntie, and the people that followed him. Above all, it was all about reclaiming Alexis. The hero smiled at Shella and said that he should be more proud and worthy. Shella winked and exclaimed that this was exactly what her ideal of a man was. Now all Leo could do now was to go forward with peace of mind and listen to praise from people. Everyone called the Blood Prince and called him the hero of their town. With the help of legends and lore, they were able to win the hearts of the people. Every person asked Leonardo himself to look in their direction. Now these people were completely different from those who looked at him with disdain and called him a bloody prince. But the hero still thought that they had not cleansed the bloodstained bad reputation. One of the men grinned and remarked on the bravery of a true knight such as the Blood Prince. Although it was slow, but their advance was definitely steady. The hero glanced at the black raven in the sky and mentally told his aunt that the time to reclaim the soul's native place was approaching. Rumors and talk of the Blood Prince reached the rest of the aristocrats as well. It seemed that some weirdo continued to subdue the bandits. The aristocrats felt that they should have started with the messenger, realizing their origins. They didn't like that the talk was again about this half-blood, a disgrace to the imperial family. It seems that there were people who addressed him as a hero, and to the aristocrats, it looked rather ridiculous. Nevertheless, judging from the brothers' history, Grandfather guessed His Highness's feelings. The second Prince Clodo asked Grandfather not to worry about it. He was sorry that he was born a few hours early. In that case, the Crown Prince would have been him. Right now, he wanted some time to himself. One of the aristocrats didn't understand where His Highness was going. One of those present hit him on the head and said that His Highness excelling in the literary and military arts would definitely be busy. Grandpa grinned and agreed that he wouldn't be a hindrance to them if they continued to go with the flow. The girls in the audience smiled at the Chardo Prince and said that they were pleased to see him. Still, the gentleman who graduated from the main military school was completely different. Chardo paid no attention to their words and lowered his head. He remembered the moment when he suggested his grandfather to nickname the half-breed prince who survived by eating people's blood. Chardo was furious that the bloody prince had been dubbed a hero. Unable to contain his anger, the prince slammed his fist into the wall. He was angry at the position in society of this half-breed who was also his younger brother. On Claude's calendar was the year 211. The second month. For the past 2 years, the Knights of Alexis had been pacifying bandits in various regions, stationing themselves in the imperial capital for the sake of rebuilding Alexis. The hero believed that rest was also important work. After rescuing the province of Jan from brutal bandits, they took a short rest. Each of them was absent from the main mansion of Alexis province, located in the imperial capital, to rest. One of the soldiers was about to look at his daughter's face, but Bauman told Gazar that it was too early to teach the child. If you notice, only Shella and His Highness remained in the mansion. For unknown reasons, Shella was experiencing excitement. Shella had time to conjure up romantic stories for herself, how the prince would be able to stroke her head and tell her that it was now just the two of them. She would surely tell His Highness that her heart wasn't ready yet. Shella was going crazy with her own thoughts. The girl dropped her quill and left the room, thinking that now was a situation not for her wild imagination. Shella decided that there was no way she was going to miss this precious opportunity to get her hands on His Majesty. Such a chance only came once in a lifetime, so she absolutely had to do it. Shella had already imagined that she would be able to spend this weekend just the two of her and His Highness. Shella started looking for His Highness around the palace, but so far she couldn't find him anywhere. As the girl was walking down the hallway, she noticed a figure in the window. It was Leo, who was practicing with his sword all the time and constantly counting out loud. Shella recalled the very day when the boy was practicing together with her aunt. Already since she was a child, she had taken a liking to Leo. Shella approached the tired hero and asked him to rest properly while they were not working. Besides, it was one of the war's jobs. Leo smiled as he saw the Dono strategist in front of him. Shella pointed her finger at him and warned him that great overwork was a poison to the body. Even Alan herself thought about it and would hold a Thanksgiving banquet in the coming days. The hero thought she was right and said that he still couldn't resist what the strategist said. Dono. Shella got angry and asked to be called by her first name. Leo apologized to her, but he didn't know what to do even while on vacation. Shella thought that this was just what she needed. Now was the time for her dating plan she had labored over yesterday. Shella waved her hands and said that she had suggestions in that case. She usually didn't even have a chance to go shopping, so they could buy things they liked and then get candy online in town afterwards. They could also watch the theater since the weather was nice today. The two of them could chat side by side against the setting sun in the harbor, indulging in sentimentality. Seeing Leo's gaze on her, Shella covered her face with her palms and turned away. Shella tried to justify herself and said that it wasn't what she meant. She didn't want to do anything to His Highness and had no shameful desires. Leo laughed strangely somehow and said with a smile that he thought about it. Leo apologized and in that case offered Shell to keep him company. The girl gladly agreed and rushed away, saying that she would soon prepare and take a horse. To the hero's surprise, the Shelia arrived on a Zenzas. The hero asked her about her horse and the Shella lied that she couldn't find it. On top of that, it was still a little cold. Shella dreamed that they should have ridden together, pressed up against each other. While she was thinking about it, she stroked Zanzas, but the horse bucked, causing Shella to lose her balance. The hero caught the falling Shella and asked if she was all right. It was a surprise to her, but the girl replied that she was fine. She grinned and said that Zanzas was apparently jealous. The horse actually looked kind of disgruntled. Suddenly, Shella saw her white horse running at them, who was disturbed by her mistress's shouts. Shella embarrassedly replied that she was apparently where she usually was. One could tell by the satisfied face of the Zanzas that he had released Shella's horse. In that case, it was safe to set off and everyone climbed on his horse. As the Shella followed the guy, she felt a lot of excitement. Right now they had a real date in the city, but she was seeing it like a dream. Still, when it came to the date, she was very nervous. The girl tried to reach out her hand to the hero's hand, but someone sharply called out to the prince and he turned around. It was an old man who introduced himself as a Neuer from the province of Jan. He sincerely thanked the bloody prince for pacifying the bandits at that time. Everyone who heard this nickname started coming up to them and greeted the prince. Rumors said that he had pacified bandits in every region. Eventually, the Blood Prince was encircled and the Shella was left all alone with his horse. In the middle of the crowd, Shella spotted her familiar and asked the Dali-san why they were here. The hooded girl replied that they had come here on a tour. What seemed most important to the girl was that Shella was on a date with His Highness. Shella experienced that very excitement again and tried to deny it. The woman grinned and said that Shella was being very nice as usual. Someone in the crowd notified that the master of the troupe had arrived and the Dahlia told Shella that she would not disturb them. Shella thought it was surprising that the Dahlia did not want to meet His Highness. The woman smiled and said they would meet again soon. She wanted to say something else to Shell and moved closer to her ear. Dahlia wanted to give the girl some advice to further attract His Highness's attention. After what Dahlia said, steam came out of the Shella's ears. Dahlia smiled and walked forward while asking her to say hello to His Highness. The prince approached the embarrassed Shella and said that he had received too many gifts from people. He noticed that the Shella's face was quite red and asked what was the matter. Leo assumed that she was sick, but the Shella replied that it was no big deal. Shella tried to assure that it wasn't like that at all and she was fine. But it seemed to Leo that, in all likelihood, she was trying to force herself to do something and offered to go back in. But Shella exclaimed that she absolutely refused. Thereafter, during their walk, Shella narrated how she had met Dahlia. Also, Shella conveyed greetings from her to His Highness. The hero sat down on the ledge of the road and confessed that he missed it. Auntie was partial to Dahlia's band during the Alexis tour. Rosalie herself often took Leo with her to see it. Auntie and Alan laughed and cried with their mouths wide open. He also remembered how Shella used to follow behind, attached to her older sister Dahlia, and it was quite funny. At that time, Shella thought that days like that would go on forever. Shella sat down next to the hero with a smile, indulging in shared memories. She replied that they would still have the opportunity to meet Dahlia-san soon, but Leo didn't understand what she meant. Shella tried to come to her senses and thought that this was the promised meeting between her elder sister and His Highness. She speculated that it might have been a secret rendezvous. Regardless, she tipped her for something. Shella assumed that this was quite common among adults. Leo noticed something was wrong with the girl and asked her a question. Shella replied that there was nothing wrong with it. Shella tried to push her thoughts away and thought that only an older sister could do such a thing. Suddenly, Leo thanked Shella. He wanted to thank her for today and also for that day 2 years ago. Then she asked for permission to help him get revenge and also to return to Lint and to Alexis. Above all, it was Rosalie's request. Guy remembered the moment he had decided to revive Alexis. He had learned a lot then, being near his aunt than anyone else in this place. Shella's words had strengthened the unity, and it made him realize that it wasn't a mistake. Leo smiled at the girl and said that the Shella had saved him, but the Shella replied that it was absolutely not true. The girl looked away and replied that it was a promise to Rosalie herself. Leo sipped from the bottle and said he understood her. Leo took a few more sips and then said that henceforth he would count on Shella for the return of their happiness. Shella smiled and happily agreed with him. The girl was once again visited by those strange sudden thoughts when Leo would approach her and touch her cheek, saying that it was all for their happiness. Shella blushed and thought that it wouldn't happen. But maybe if they had that atmosphere, there was one more push left. Shella thought that her date plan had somehow worked so far. Here was the perfect place for the two of them to bond against the backdrop of the sunset. The girl thought His Highness's cheeks flushed and decided that was excellent. She remembered the words of Dahlia, who had given her advice for attracting His Highness's attention. Shella should definitely attack with her attractiveness, and Shella decided that here was just the decisive moment. With these thoughts, she threw off half of her cloak. Dahlia felt that she should have used her body, which was clearly being wasted. At a moment like this, no matter how bored they were, His Highness would surely be easily confused. Shella thought that giving her such advice was a mistake. The girl motioned to Leo herself and asked her to listen. She was sure that from now on, His Highness's heart would be hers. She gently touched his shoulder and said that her body felt like it was on fire. As soon as she touched the guy, Leo fell to the ground and dropped the wine bottle from her hand. Shella immediately forgot her plan and called out to His Highness in shock. Just at that moment, a bauman was passing nearby and heard a familiar voice. The girl was calling for help and screaming. Bauman looked out from behind the wall and asked Shella what was the matter. The girl nervously pointed at the hero and said that His Highness had suddenly fallen to the ground. It turned out that Leo was very drunk. In addition, Bauman became interested in the appearance of the Shella, but the girl hit him instead of answering. Thus ended the strategy of an exciting day off, His Highness and Shella. Bauman got slapped, and His Highness was found to be unable to drink. But it looked pretty cute. In the end, the Shella failed, but she was very pleased. Shella yawned in front of her notebook and thought that today she had once again felt Rosalia's will herself. Her will was undoubtedly inherited in His Highness, so Rosalia herself could be sure of it. Just at that moment, Leo walked past Shella's room. He noticed that Shella had fallen asleep right at the table. Leo quietly approached and discreetly threw a plaid over Shella's back. The sleeping girl thought that someday His Highness and all of Alexis would be able to see their native lands again and once again be immersed in the sunset of the great land of dawn. On Claude's calendar it was the year 211, the second month. All further events took place in the main mansion of Alexis province. Bauman asked the boys how the two of them had spent their day off. Bauman wanted to remind them, but Leo asked him to stop. Shella confirmed it and said that nothing embarrassing happened between them. Leo asked her to stop, and all the other soldiers didn't understand what they were even talking about. Other than that, they had to pack up and go, because the Earl of Idonia would hold a special Thanksgiving banquet for the Alexis Knight squad. He not only supported them, but also arranged this banquet. Bauman said that she couldn't raise her head in front of Alan herself. Before he left, he promised that he would do his best to definitely help them. Leo didn't doubt his words, but he knew that Alan Sama was also in trouble. About a year after his father's death, he inherited the title in addition to this heavy burden. He also had problems and disputes surrounding fishing rights on Lake Ia with the neighboring province of Kuramiria. In addition, rumor has it that the rightful heir to the house of Count Kuramiria is a scoundrel. Bauman heard that there are close ties to the second prince, who is the older brother of His Highness' other mother. Shell found it interesting that Bauman-san was unexpectedly knowledgeable in the area. The soldier flared his nostrils and said that he was the adjutant of the Alexis Gazaru Knight squad after all. Chardo's older brother had a grandfather Dinkudo from the Society of the Four Court Aristocrats. It was probably burdening everything. One of the soldiers suggested that they not talk about formalities, at least today. Mero brought the bottle to his lips and said that today was the day of the banquet after all. The guys were shocked that Mero was already drinking at such an early hour, but the soldier thought that by maintaining the state of affairs in the trade, Alan himself could also go and enjoy it. Shella didn't hear any justification for drinking in his words and asked Leo for his opinion. Leo thought that indeed, as the teacher said, it was possible to dispense with formalities today. Meru offered the Shella a drink, for even his highness was on his side. Shella looked at his bottle suspiciously, doubting that it was wine. Bauman blushed and whispered in Shella's ear that a slightly drunken woman warms a man's heart. Shella apparently realized what he meant and blushed. Shella ran up to Meru and asked for permission to drink from his bottle. Meru didn't mind and gave her a drink. The girl abruptly snatched the bottle from his hands and thought that in that case she could win the heart of his highness. The hero already had a psychological trauma about this, so he asked the Shella to stop, because she might regret it. Meru laughed and said that Alexis wars were strongest and also the liquor was formless. Leo asked Meru not to support this idea, and Bauman laughed. The man with the eye patch told Meru that they were going to go ahead. Bauman said that now they had to hurry up and pack up too. While on the second floor of the building, Bauman noticed that the envoy of the Empire, Clodo Oberchamberlain of the court, had arrived here. The envoy was unhappy that he had specially arrived here, but he was nevertheless not greeted by anyone. In addition, the envoy was not happy with the half-breed, who, giving into his mood, tamed the bandits. Bauman didn't understand what the grumpy Chamberlain was here for. He suggested that Shella might have done something, but the girl exclaimed that she hadn't done anything. Leo asked them not to worry about it and admitted that he had invited them. He asked to escort their guests to the guest room. The disgruntled Chamberlain opened his letter and began to read it out. For his feat of subduing a group of bandits rampaging in the province of Jan, the hero received a gift of an ancient sword from the Emperor, a legacy of the imperial family. Also, this ancient sword had been passed down from generation to generation since the time of the first emperor. This forged sword was an honorable object. His assistants were certain that there was no such thing written there. However, the two of them had to hold this heavy sword together. But even with their combined efforts, their hands were already at their limit. The guys thought about the fact that the most wasteful mouth in the imperial capital had appeared here. The helpers were patient to the last to avoid making a mistake. They realized that if something happened to the sword, more than just punishment would await them. Meanwhile, as the disgruntled old man read out the document, he didn't understand why he had to do all this. The two men finally waited until the moment to hand the sword to the hero and asked about his escort. Leo asked not to worry about it and held out his hand for the sword. The Chamberlain smirked at the fact that Leo apparently thought he was strong. But as soon as Leo got his sword in his hand, he took it out of its sheath. With one swing of his arm, he managed to cleave the air, and his hand didn't even tremble. A stream of wind crashed into the faces of the Chamberlain and his assistants, who were taken aback by such a surprise. There was a satisfied smile on Leo's face. Leo exclaimed that it was very different from the usual items, and this sword was excellent. The disgruntled Chamberlain muttered that it was quite understandable. Yet despite the lad's fine manners, the Chamberlain didn't like Leo at all. The hero got down on one knee and sincerely thanked for the gift he received from the Emperor for pacifying the bandits and asked for a bow to the Emperor. The Chamberlain chuckled and asked about the mare that Leo had received earlier. He hoped she was fine. It was the fastest, strongest, and most outstanding of the over 100 fine horses presented to the stables of the Imperial Palace. In reality, however, the Chamberlain knew that it was a stubborn horse that could not carry a rider. The old man exclaimed that it was a very fitting gift as a reward for first subduing the bandits. But unless he was a skillful rider, he would not be able to rule the horse. He was worried that the hero wouldn't be able to handle it, and would make horseflesh out of it. Meanwhile, the assistants thought that the Chamberlain was indeed a man who could talk. The fellow asked to call his horse by the name of Zanzas and offered to look at it. His black horse looked rather terrifying in the Chamberlain's face. The horse stood on its haunches, thus scaring the old man and his assistants to death. Leo petted his four-legged partner and asked him to be quieter. Apparently, he had tamed this horse well. Leo explained that this mare was still excited that a group of people from the Empire had arrived here. She had recently sent one such to the hospital. The Chamberlain along with the boys hurriedly left here and asked her to discipline her from such rudeness next time. The helpers could hardly keep up with the old man and asked him to wait for them. The guy gave them a smiling look and his mare snorted unhappily with her nose, clearly pleased at the disappearance of these men. Bauman and Shella thought that Zanzas and Leo had done a good job. Shella, in her joy, suggested they scatter salt. The hero asked not to talk like that. He specifically wanted to invite up to the Chamberlain's mansion. He had to do so, no matter how much the latter was important. Besides, the Emperor was also unexpectedly honest and handed him such an awesome sword. Now they could also head to the wine house where the Alan was already waiting for them. The boys got on their horses and set off to their destination point through the crowded city. As they rode along, Bauman kept coming across beautiful girls along the way. Moreover, one of them who was sitting on the balcony of a building called him Big Brother and offered to play with him. Bauman blushed and turned away, pretending not to hear her. The heroes arrived at their destination point and Leo said that apparently it was here. It was a beautiful wine house in the style of a true Eastern empire. Inside, people were stirred up by the fact that the Dahlia group was holding a performance today. A drunken Marrow grabbed Bauman by the shoulder and said that they were late. A young beautiful girl approached Leo and greeted his highness. The boy asked her about the Earl of Idonia and the girl led him to the second floor. On the way, she said that there were always rumors about Leo, plus she had heard stories from Alan herself. Leo met Alan in a private room and greeted him with a smile. The character thought it was an exquisite idea for an establishment and it was very characteristic of Alan. Alan smiled and told Leo that it had been a long time since they had seen each other. Count Alan was the lord of the province of Idonia. The guy smiled and said that he couldn't trivialize thanking the only heroes of the empire. As always, Leo would like to apologize to him, but Alan smiled and said not to worry about it. After all, they were friends. Besides, Alan was annoyed that he was not capable of practicing it. But if everything materialized, he would like to run around the battlefield with Leo again. Leo smiled and said that it was highly unwise to tell the Count of Idonia. Alan winked at him and agreed, then handed the guy a glass of orange drink. By all appearances, Alan was doing well as a lord and Alan confirmed it. He smiled at his friend and raised his glass upwards. For a year he tried to remember his late father's back and finally knew what he had to do. Alan once again respected his father and loved his estates and cared for his people. Undoubtedly, he was an example of a nobleman. In addition, he courageously did not bend even if the opponent was a forecourt nobleman. Alan was a gentleman with justice and supported his aunt in Alexis' defensive war. Alan nodded approvingly and said that he wanted to be like him. He believed that this was what a true nobleman should be like. The hero smiled and reciprocated Alan. They had wide backs to strive for. With these words, the boys pounded each other's fists, as usual. Alan was in complete agreement with Leo and shared his views. They clinked their glasses and decided to drink to the peace of Idonia, and to the military success of Alexis' Knight Squad. Alan looked down from the balcony and offered a glimpse of this Leo. In front of them was a rather young girl who was doing very well in her role. In addition, she was a beauty and quite skillful. Moreover, her good disposition was not to avoid a dirty role. Alan laughed and Leo only smiled slightly. At that moment a girl came into their room and noticed that the guys were still on good terms. But since the kind warriors were on vacation today, so she offered to admit the two beauties into the conversation. She hoped they wouldn't get punished for it and winked coquettishly at the guys. The hostess of the group Dahlia bowed to His Highness Alan and said that it had been a long time since they had seen each other. The blushing Alan smiled and said that they haven't seen each other for a long time. He asked the skillful beauty and good actress to pass to them. Besides, it seemed to Alan that everything looked as if the quality of the theater itself had improved. Leo was in agreement with him. Dahlia winked and thanked Alan herself for the compliment. In her opinion, the quality of the performance was understandable, but a woman's face could be enchanted by makeup alone. She asked to have fun with it with caution and asked for Shella's opinion. Shella, who was standing next to her, blushed and agreed with her. Leo laughed at her words. Alan thought that saying something like that made him want to see a face without makeup one day more closely. Dahlia stated with a smile that the bed was upstairs and they could arrange that at any time if he was so interested in it. It was said that Dahlia's profession was serious stage acting, and Alan also recognized that. The girl grinned and said that Alan himself was also good at acting. Shella opened her mouth in horror as the Dahlia walked up to His Highness and put her arm around his waist. She jabbed a finger at his chest and offered to be her partner if he put the case down. Shella shouted that she was not allowed to do anything with His Highness. The girl jealously grabbed His Highness' other hand and offered to play with Alan herself. Alan laughed at the fact that the Shella was kindly providing him with Dahlia. Leo felt awkward between the two girls. It was as if he was between two fires. Dahlia laughed, but Shella didn't understand what was so funny about it. Dahlia suggested that Shella look at herself in the mirror, because she looked too desperate right now. Shella saw her flushed, flustered, and yet angry face in the small mirror. She hoped it was some sort of joke from her older sister. Alan at times couldn't even believe she could be called a decent strategist. Shella asked Alan not to talk about it. Dahlia had long since stopped holding the hero's hand, but Shella was still jealously clinging to Leo. Leo apologized to Dahlia, but his head was filled with things to do to get Alexis back. So at least until he got Alexis back, He was not going to form a relationship with anyone, not a man or a woman. At first everyone was taken aback by this answer, but then they laughed amicably. Leo did not understand what he had said wrong and asked Shella about it. Shella asked him to leave it at that. Shella pulled the guy's hand towards her and said that there will be no problem with it because she will always be there for him. Looking at all this, Dahlia giggled contentedly. Alan apologized to Shella and asked her to bring them a second meal. She was free to choose the tastiest thing for Leo on her own. Shella grabbed the basket and was going to bring them something delicious immediately. In farewell, she asked His Highness to wait for her for a while, and ran away. As expected from Alan himself, the service here was brilliant. Leo truly felt that he would never be Alan's equal in this in his entire life. As always, he apologized for that. Alan winked and bumped Leo's fist, saying that they were friends. As they were celebrating, someone's disgruntled exclamation was heard downstairs. A certain visitor ordered him to repeat what he had been told. The owner replied that he was sorry, but the establishment was booked all day today. The man shouted that he was the heir to the house of the Count of Karimari, and he was being charged that he would not be welcome here. The old man sweated with excitement and said that the establishment had been booked by Count Idonia. The Count in a rage grabbed the old man by his clothes and lifted him off the ground. He felt that the old man was overcharging the house of Alan before their house. The pot-bellied lord had already grabbed his sword, unwilling to accept such insults. The old man covered his eyes in consternation, but someone ordered the Lord Keynes to stop it. Looking around, the Lord saw His Highness Chardo. Chardo smirked and told Keynes that he was greatly disappointing him just like his younger brother. The owner of the establishment did not understand how Chardo knew this, for he had not mentioned a word about Leo. Chardo warned the owner of the establishment that he would come here again, and then he would give them a feast. The old man had to agree to this, and the Lord tisked unhappily. He told the host that he was lucky this time, but he didn't think there wouldn't be a next time. The Lord grabbed the old man by the chin and told him that if he tried to commit the same rudeness again, his head would become the signboard of this establishment. The Lord came so close to the master's face that his drool flew into the old man's face. He ordered to listen to the heir to the Keynes of the House of Curium and to memorize that face well. After the threat, he threw the old man to the ground and smugly smirked. Chardo managed to get ahead and Lord Keynes asked His Highness to wait for him. Leo's older brother couldn't help but think of their celebration on this day. Mentally cursing, he called his younger brother a hated half-breed. Lord Keynes believed that Alan was like a shadow and a mere village knight unlike him. He believed that the Alan had committed disrespect by not accepting His Highness Chardo. His aide agreed with the Lord and replied that it was utterly inexcusable. It seemed to Lord Keynes that he and the half-breed had together lately succumbed to the mood. To some extent, they had subdued the hordes of some bandits and received praise from the ignorant crowd who didn't know the reason. They must have forgotten their position in society. Chardo did not like that his nickname of Blood Prince was now synonymous with hero. Lord Keynes exclaimed that this was no laughing matter. Alan followed the half-breed and assiduously provided support for military expenses. As expected of an Idonia bloodline, it was true ignorance and their actions were foolish. Chardo smirked and said that the Lords Cumirius and Idonia had a fate of close relations. Lord Keynes did not understand what he meant. After thinking with his brain for a while, Lord Keynes smugly smirked and replied that Chardo was right. Keynes asked His Highness to hear him out. For generations they had been arguing over fishing rights on Lake Io, which was located by both provinces. The previous reason was the invasion of Idonia territory, and they had a basis for the dispute. Recently, their fishing boats were attacked and their fish were taken away, and their ships were sunk. They had done many bad deeds, as if as pirates, though they were undoubtedly pacifists. Chardo reacted strangely and calmly to this news. He asked the Lord not to overlook the injustice of Idonia. Lord Keynes looked contentedly at Chardo and exclaimed that His Highness understood everything. Chardo smiled slyly at the Lord and said that he would definitely help them. He was going to ask the Emperor for it right away. Lord Keynes was happy and thanked Chardo for his help. The Count laughed so hard that he grabbed his full stomach. He clenched his hand into a fist and said that he would certainly destroy them. Now Lord Keynes was going to destroy Idonia and Alan himself. Behind him he heard the whispering of the women, who were vigorously discussing the rightful heir to the Kiramiria. They thought that he was quite ugly and had a huge difference with the neighboring province of Idonia. In addition, they believed that a woman who married him would be like being in hell. Lord Keynes exclaimed that the end would soon come for the half-breed and the village knight pretending to be false heroes. Chardo was already smilingly imagining his reward for this vacation. He was contemplating their path to destruction, and now he could let the heroes leisurely enjoy their remaining days. Alan stood on the roof of the building with his father, who asked his son if he liked their province. Alan replied that of course he did. His father smiled and replied that he liked it too. Frankly, Alan was worried whether he could defend Idonia as a blameless lord. Father smiled and replied that no one was blameless, but Alan needed to make no mistake about what he had to protect. Alan knew he didn't realize it yet. Alan had counted on his father's explanation, but his father had only said that time would come and his son would understand it. As he left, his father had no doubt that everything would be alright if it was Alan. Alan hurriedly caught up with his father and asked him to stop. Alan opened his eyes abruptly and held out his hand in front of him. He slowly got up from the bed and held his head, thinking that he was having that dream again. He saw it every day now and thought that his father had prompted something. Alan felt like he was missing something. At that moment his sister came into his room and called out to his older brother. She was unhappy that her brother was sleeping so much and called him Asanya. Alan replied to his sister Myria that he would be getting up now and covered himself with a blanket. The girl squinted at him and agreed. Alan's younger sister was the eldest daughter of the House of Idonia. Myria thought that if something like this happened, her father could stand at the bedside, but it wasn't too late yet. Despite being less than a week away from the first anniversary of her father's death, he still couldn't focus. Many nobles in the imperial family had been invited. A magnificent ceremony had to be held. If the Alan treated it carelessly, he could jeopardize the honor of their house. Alan grinned and said that if this way he could talk to his father again, he didn't mind. His sister frowned and didn't understand his silly joke. She doubted that at this rate they would be able to finish their preparations before Uncle Douglas arrived. Uncle had been assigned to observe the Chiramiria in the northernmost territory of Idonia, and he would arrive in 5 days. Alan asked not to worry, for everything was in order and their business was progressing well. Alan turned to his aunt, whose name was Amanda. He complimented her, noticing that she had trimmed her bangs and told her that she was even more beautiful. Myria blushed so with anger at her brother. Unable to bear it, she grabbed the bedside lamp and swung it at her brother. Just like that, she was worried because of her older brother's condition. Alan warned his sister that if only the wrinkles between those eyebrows were joined, she would soon become an old lady. Myra didn't like that he talked too much. Madishka asked her sister not to run, but Myra asked her to stop Alan's bad behavior. Mother could not understand to the end what their relationship was. Alan told the boys that he was counting on everyone. Also, they had to make a great ceremony today and not shame their father's name. Alan dressed formally and with a folder in hand, he set about organizing the event. The boy's mother was proud that Alan was doing a great job with all the things, but sister was not happy with him. She thought that mother didn't understand anything, for her elder brother was a foolish mood man. Mother was upset that her child was profane and thought that she was really a noblewoman's daughter. The woman along with her little helper approached Alan with her things and asked where to take it all to. The boy asked to take it to the common room, but the woman suddenly stumbled and started to fall. Alan picked the woman up, preventing her from falling down the stairs while catching all the plates at the same time. The woman apologized for her little boy who had also stumbled, but Alan laughed and replied that he was fine. He hoped that Amanda-san hadn't bruised herself. Amanda looked at her son unhappily and warned him more than once that he should have looked well ahead. The boy sadly lowered his head and apologized to his mother. Alan remembered the moment when they were contemplating a name for this infant. The boy was shocked at how much this boy had grown and stroked his head. He thanked the Kraju for his help and said that their father would have been happy about it too. The mother noticed that her child was embarrassed, and the Alan thought he was quite glorious. Kraju apologized to Alan and suddenly asked if he knew anything about the Blood Prince. The mother smacked the child on the head again, reminding him that his name was Prince Leonardo. Alan grinned and thought he was interested in Prince Leonard. The boy exclaimed that Leonardo had been a hero, putting down bad bandits, and he would like to be a knight like that someday. Alan was surprised to hear such a statement. He mentally turned to Leo and told his friend that their plan was fully starting to come to fruition. Alan exclaimed that of course he knew the Blood Prince, for he and Leo were friends. The boy's eyes shone with delight. In that case, before they were noticed by his grumpy little sister, Alan decided to tell a little about the past. No sooner had he said this than Myryu appeared behind him and asked about the one he called Grumpy Sister. The sister grabbed her sword and chased after the boys, ordering the foolish brother to work properly. The boy wanted to hear the story from Alan himself, and Alan was running away from Myria. The boys ran along the walls where a portrait of their late father watched them in a gorgeous frame. Claude's calendar then still showed the year 203. This whole story took place 8 years ago in the province of Idonia, the capital of Idon. The woman told the boys that she could manage somehow on her own and apologized to them for the inconvenience. Count Idonia father Alan laughed, not realizing what she was saying. Since she wasn't alone, she needed to be taken care of. It was natural for a man to do so. Alan replied to the pregnant Amanda that it was okay because mother told him to do it. Still, the disgruntled brother felt that Sister Myryu was not needed by them at all. Sister shouted that she would not allow her to be excluded from the group. The father agreed with the sister at first, but Alan exclaimed that Myryu had been assigned to watch over him. Myryu excitedly replied that her brother was wrong. As soon as the locals noticed the Lord, they began to approach him. A local offered the Lord some grape wine that was made this year and offered him a drink. Alan's father exclaimed that it was good news, but now he was with his children, so he would come to him secretly another time. The man smiled and said they would wait. Another man called out to the Lord and asked him to come in to see them as well. They had milk from his house which was special. Miranda grinned and told the children that their father was still popular. Myril still didn't like the fact that their father was treated like a weirdo. Miranda suggested that little sister did not like her father, but Myryu exclaimed that she loved him. Looking at his father, Alan once asked Amanda if he could ever become a lord like his father. She had no doubts about it and asked him to be confident. The locals approached the Lord and asked to hear them out. Apparently it was some unpleasant news and the Lord promised to go now and speak to the Kuramiria. Later, Alan's father arrived in the capital of the empire at the main mansion of the Kuramiria province. There he thanked the Count of Kuramiria for arranging a meeting at this place today. The Count laughed and asked to dispense with the formal greeting. Besides, this time he approved the request to introduce the eldest sons of the heirs of both families. The Count suggested to the Count of Idonia to be on good terms with each other as neighboring provinces. The Count asked the opinion of his youngest son Canes, who was sure to agree with his father. The boy exclaimed that he would also like to be friends with Alan. Alan reciprocated and said that the relationship with Kuramiria was also because of this. Alan hoped that their relationship could improve. Even then, it was already evident that the father and son Kuramiria were up to something amiss and pulled fake smiles on their faces. Canes would kindly offer to show the mansion to Alan and his younger sister. His father thought it was a good thing, as they were probably tired of adult conversation. He asked the Count of Idonia's opinion and Alan's father agreed. He thought it would make a good place of learning for them. Canes grabbed his sister and brother's hands and offered them something to eat. There were lots of sweets prepared in another hall and the boy pulled the boys along. When the children left their room, Alan's father became anxious, but the Count asked him not to worry. He suggested that, as adults, they calmly discuss the matter regarding the incident at Lake Ia. The Count was sure that for Alan's father, this conversation was bound to be a favorable one. The Earl of Idonia frowned unhappily. Meanwhile, Kynes grabbed the sweets in his hands and ordered the girl to eat more. While Canes was forcibly shoving sweets into her mouth and ordering her to eat more, the rest of Canes' brothers restrained her brother Alan and prevented him from helping her. Alan begged Canes for his brothers to let him go. Canes nastily licked the lollipop and smiled, saying that he was only being kind to them. Canes assumed that the house of Idonius was inhabited by rude people with a complete disregard for treating others. He held out the lollipop he had licked to the girl's lips and ordered her to eat. He felt that she should not have been tolerated. Alan's sister exclaimed that she wouldn't eat it and called the insolent Canes a fat pig. The boy was furious when the girl called him that. He shouted that he was just in good physique. At some point, Alan was able to free himself from the guy's hands and rushed to his sister's aid. Alan pushed Canes with all his might, causing the fat guy to fall to the ground. Alan ordered him to stop and thought that in all likelihood they would not be friends with him. Canes was breathing heavily and sitting on his knees. He told Alan that he had done it first and used force on him, pushing him back. Canes believed that Alan should have known the consequences and the severing of the relationship of both provinces. The quarrel would become something more and develop into a cause of war. Alan asked the lad for forgiveness in fear, but Canes wasn't enough. Rising to his feet, he ordered Alan to kneel in front of him and rub his forehead on the floor. Canes wanted Alan to keep apologizing until he stopped him. The guys started pounding on Alan's back, making him apologize each time and keep his head down. His sister had to watch her brother being pounced on from all sides and humiliated. The guys pretended not to hear him and ordered him to speak louder. The sister was so hurt to watch her brother that tears came to her eyes. She ordered him to stop it, for Canes had done the same thing to him. Besides, she could not understand such treats and said that Alan was only protecting her. The girl thought she was right, but the angry Canes flared his nostrils and ordered her to be silent. Canes thought she should keep quiet and not look down on him. Besides, a kid her age clearly didn't understand anything. The boy blamed it on the adults, even though she didn't understand anything. The girl really didn't understand what adults had to do with it. In that case, she decided to call her father and wanted to leave, but Alan stopped her and asked her not to go. Even though he was being bullied and MANHWA was crying, he asked her not to disturb her fathers. Alan gritted his teeth and said that this responsibility was on him. Keynes was overjoyed and laughed. He could only praise Alan Kuhn for his determination. After saying these words, Keynes punched Alan in the ribs. Unable to bear this horror, MANHWA covered her ears with her hands and closed her eyes. Eventually, when they returned to their fathers, Keynes apologized. He did not expect Alan to fall down the stairs and he was clearly unlucky. Keynes apologized again, because if he had been careful, this wouldn't have happened. Alan's father asked not to apologize and suggested that his son had been unwittingly charmed by their magnificent mansion. Having said this, the Count laughed. In the end, the father of Keynes expressed his sincere regret to the Earl of Idonia for the incident of the invasion at Lakia this time. Henceforth, he suggested that they modestly take care of their relations with each other. The children had no choice but to remain silent, and their father agreed to the Count's suggestion. When the Count along with the children left the mansion, the girl wanted to tell her father the whole truth, but the father interrupted her and questioned the boy. He wanted to make sure that his son had really fallen. Battered with swollen cheeks, Alan held back his tears with all his might and agreed with his father. One day the father asked the lad if he liked Idonia. Alan smiled and replied that he liked her very much and it was natural. Someday Alan also wanted to be like his father. He wanted to be loved by the people, love the province, and be an impeccable lord. His father had no doubt that his son would become a lord, that he would carry Idonia. In Alan's eyes he would be an impeccable lord. The father smiled and admitted that for him it would be the best happiness. First of all, the lord was a human being, and no one was flawless. After all, he stood here with the support of others. This is the population of the dominions of his land. Only when there are such people, Alan's father could be like a lord. Those who stood above should not forget that and should not be mistaken about what they had to protect. Alan thought about what he had to protect and exclaimed that someday he would realize it. But after their meeting with the Count, he only realized that he was very weak. He was weak as a man and as a man. He realized that in this way he could not even protect what he should protect. Alan clenched his hands into fists and said that he wished he could get stronger. His father wanted to make sure that he really was. In that case, he agreed to put everything he could into his son's head. He would then provide an excellent warrior he knew, so the Alan could train there. Thus, Alan came to be trained by Rosalie Sama. She was immediately warned that this young man was a bit smug. Alan was introduced to the rightful heiress of the House of Idonia. Mero didn't understand what the eldest son of the Earl of Idonia was doing here. The woman replied that he was here at the Count's request to train. He wanted to acquire the strength to bear the burden of all the people of the domain. Though Rosalie hated such pompousness, it didn't matter. Even though he was the Earl's eldest son, she agreed to train him without hesitation. This was exactly what Mero expected from Rosalie herself. Besides, the woman thought that this young man could be a good opponent for Mero. She ordered all the soldiers to take a firmer stance. Rosalie ordered the archers to get ready and everyone got into a fighting stance. The woman was already looking forward to its development. Alan thought that everything was in order and intended to do so. Suddenly, he heard the cheers of people who were admiring someone's victory. The soldiers laughed and said that he had already defeated 10 people. They wondered who would fight His Highness who had improved his skill again. Alan hid his sword in its scabbard and asked for a round with him. That was when they met Leo for the first time on the battlefield. Alan took his sword in his hands and prepared for battle. Alan was very pleased to meet His Highness. That's what they called him, because Leo was still from the imperial family or something like that. Leo was quite serious and asked him to get ready as soon as possible. After all, it was irrelevant now. Alan chuckled at his words. He wondered why Leo was training in sword and asked him a question. Leo replied in complete seriousness that he wanted to acquire the power to protect himself. Alan laughed and said that in that case he couldn't lose to him. Someday he would like to become responsible for protecting many people. Alan didn't know the manners of someone like Leo, but he wasn't going to lose to him. With those words, he went to attack His Highness. No sooner had the lad struck him than Leo knocked the sword out of Alan's hands in one fell swoop. Alan fell to the ground and Leo apologized for his manners. Putting the sword to his face, Leo said that if he couldn't even protect himself, he couldn't protect anyone. At first Alan looked at Leo confusedly, but then he agreed with him. Indeed, what he said was true, so Alan would like to apologize. But still, it didn't mean that he was just a beaten weakling. The guy grabbed his sword, kneeled down and asked to accept another round. Leo was impressed by such unexpected determination. Looking at them from the side, Rosalie laughed. She wondered what Leo would do. He could either agree or refuse the fight. Leo bowed to Alan and motioned for him to attack. Alan thought it was funny that Leo was 4 years younger and Alan ended up losing to him. Leo replied that the result ended up being the same. Alan mentioned that he had fought 10 times before, but next time he would not let Leo win. First of all, he should have acquired the strength to defend himself. Leo blushed imperceptibly and said that he wouldn't lose to him either. It could be said that they had now become rivals. Alan gave his name and asked His Highness for his name. Leo introduced himself, after which they bumped each other's fists. This is exactly what their first meeting with Leo turned out to be. The boy was very curious to know what happened next. Alan said that after that they both worked tirelessly together on themselves and grew together. While they were talking, a younger sister suddenly burst in on them that she had found her older brother. Her sudden appearance made the boys shiver. She pointed her sword at Alan and the boy exclaimed that he was guilty before her. Yet he felt that such companionship was also important to him as a lord. Lyria asked him not to make excuses. He could tell his stories even after everything was ready and she ordered him to prepare for death. Alan asked her to stop as suddenly someone called out to him. The boy wanted to know what was wrong and assumed they were in trouble. The boy's mother reported to the host that Douglas herself had already arrived. Alan had in no way expected Uncle Douglas to arrive by now. Sister glanced irritably at her brother and told him that it was a difficult case. It was as if he had rushed his horse very hard and was now standing at the front door. Alan came down the stairs and greeted his rain-soaked uncle. The boy assumed that something was going on in the curium and asked his uncle a question. The uncle took off his hood and ordered them to prepare to raise their troops as the Cumeria was already heading towards their province. This turn of events was clearly not expected by anyone. Alan froze with horror and turned pale, unable to believe his ears. Alan put on his cloak, jumped on his horse in a hurry, and started on his way. He wanted to get to his destination as quickly as possible. He pondered the fact that in the worst situation, the Cumeria would invade and he had to do something about it. The people didn't understand why they were allowing this kind of willfulness and found the Cumeria disgusting. Plus now it was happening at the worst possible time and the people thought it was a real riot. They did not like that such lawlessness would go unpunished. Big Sister Alana asked everyone to calm down. First of all, they had to listen to Uncle Douglas. Alan was in agreement with his sister and nodded approvingly. Uncle constantly had spies in the provincial capital of Cumeria province, and the information from them should be plentiful and yet extremely accurate. It was said that they were gathering about 500 soldiers in Glinda. Alan didn't suggest that they could have done it in such a place. He was basically not sure that they could compete with the military might of Cumeria. Originally, about 1,000 or so of their personal troops were kept for the sake of defending the domain. If they didn't keep half of them, it would be difficult to defend their territory. Even if the Cumeria attacked with an army of 500, the Idonia had twice as much military power, and it was estimated that they would be able to fight. Uncle said the march would be in 10 days, and he heard that the soldiers had already been issued orders. Alan's sister thought this was a little strange. She assumed that the Cumeria were waiting for reinforcements from somewhere if they needed that much time. Even if there was a nobleman who provided soldiers, they would do well to have reinforcements of around 500. Uncle noticed how Alan was seriously thinking about it. He also told the boys that it was rumored that 3,000 pikemen would join the front. If this was indeed the case, their province would suffer great destruction. Everyone was shocked to hear that there would be 3,000, but Alan didn't understand where they could have gotten such a large army from. From the rumors, there was talk of Dinquito sending them. Alan was confused, not understanding why this man would be so helpful to the Cumerians. The people in the hall thought that this was really the end. If the four-court aristocrats were involved, they had no chance of winning. One of the women asked the gods to have mercy on them and didn't understand why they were treated like this. It was really bad. Even if not directly, one could tell that they were now going up against four-court aristocrats. One of the men had already regretted that they had continued to support Alexis in the battle against the Admaz 2 years ago. The woman disagreed with him and exclaimed that he was talking nonsense. Alan ordered them to stop and said that his father's decisions were honorable. More importantly, they had to think about what to do at the moment. This was already the current lord's problem. Alan exclaimed that it was all right, because they still had a choice. He clenched his hand into a fist and said that he would definitely protect Idonia. Lyria walked up to her older brother and called out to him. She suggested that Alan ask His Highness Leonardo for help. Alan was surprised at her sudden suggestion, but apparently she meant it. He gritted his teeth and suggested not to tell his sister nonsense, for Leo had his own situation and he had great ambitions. Alan was not going to hinder their ambitions with such situations. As a lord, he dared not show his face to either his father or Leo. In that case, his sister didn't understand why he regularly supported Alexis' squad of knights. Alan headed for the exit and said that at least it wasn't for his personal relations. Myria asked him to stop and asked where he was going. She exclaimed that their conversation wasn't over yet. Alan thought that was obvious. He was on his way to the Imperial Palace and was going to complain directly to the Emperor that such willfulness was allowed here. Alan asked her to make sure they could advance the Idonia soldiers at any time and he would head there on a fast horse. The sister tried to catch up with her brother and exclaimed that it was not enough. She still insisted that he ask for help from the Knights of Alexis. After catching up with her brother, she grabbed his sleeve and stopped him. She reminded him that this situation was not as lenient as when he was a child. Regardless, Alan was once again determined to carry the burden alone. Myria said that they were cruel, and she thought that her older brother also understood that somewhere deep in his soul. She didn't want to think about such things anymore. Moreover, she didn't want to see such an expression on her older brother's face. But she thought it was unacceptable to risk the lives of all the people of Idonia. That was why Alan had made his decision. He wanted to apply the right way to stop them from doing what they wanted them to do. He would show them how to end the incident without spilling blood in vain. The sister gritted her teeth in anger and did not understand why Alan was still talking like that. She exclaimed that this problem could not be settled with pretty words, but Alan had already gone outside. The sister was left to watch as her stubborn older brother jumped on his horse and rode away. In pursuit, Myria ordered her to do whatever he wanted. The mother cautiously called out to Myria, who was still unable to move away from her conversation with her brother. Myria ordered the horses to be prepared and declared war on Idonia. Most of the laws of Claude's empire did not apply to the nobility. Nevertheless, it was strictly forbidden to start wars without permission. Those who violated these laws became traitors. Clodo nobles could raise troops, but there was an exception. They could do so if they received an imperial order from the emperor. They were given only 3 years if they used the right of self-defense. This time the willfulness of the Curamiria and supporting them was a grave offense. Alan prepared to stop them by all means and told his father that he would exert all his willpower as a lord. As Alan was led to his audience, he was warned that status was of no consequence. It was the rule to accept audiences on a first-come, first-served basis, and he was asked to wait in the waiting room. Alan made his way to a beautiful living room with a fireplace. He had heard of nobles being in a waiting state as if they were in prison. This time it seemed to Alan that it was exactly like that. His knees and hands trembled. He realized that if the report to the emperor was powerless, the Idonia would be lost. All Alan could do now was pray for someone's help. He remembered his sister's idea to ask for His Highness Leonardo's help. Alan was sure that Leo would certainly brave the battle. But if he did so, he would incur the wrath of the four-court aristocrats, and then they would not be able to win Alexis back. Leo was a man who would carry this country someday, so he had no reason to make a wrong move because of such a circumstance. Earlier, Leo had said that no matter what he used, he would definitely take Alexis back. Alan wasn't about to become a burden to him. Alan looked bitterly at his locket, which contained a family photo. His father had entrusted Idonia to him and Alan had to do something about it. With these thoughts, the boy got to his feet. Alan noticed a girl in the doorway and told her that he was looking forward to an audience. The girl asked him to be quiet and asked him to just listen to her. Alan had never seen her before and asked who she was, but the girl replied that he should not have waited in such a place. She said that His Majesty had long ago authorized Lord Keynes to raise troops and allowed support for Lord Dinkwood. Alan was horrified to learn that they had made a formal authorization. Initially, this must be made an official announcement in proper form in their direction. The civil officials making this preparation were silent at Mr. Dinkwood's orders. This meant only that the audience and his reception were utterly unbecoming. Alan could not believe that they had gotten this far and did not understand what he was rushing here for. But if everything said was true, he didn't understand why the emperor had to give such a permission. None other than His Highness Chart with Lord Keynes made a report to the emperor. He was to punish the province of Idonia on its own for years of violating fishing rights with the province of Cumeria. Alan couldn't believe his ears and wanted to make sure that it was really His Highness Charto who did it. His Highness would invade Idonia with Lord Keynes, but the girl hoped it was just a rumor. They were going against the man who graduated from the first outstanding military school in the imperial capital, and now he was commanding a large army of 3,500 soldiers. Alan didn't know if he should have believed the evidence. Above all, he didn't understand why this woman would risk herself so much to tell him about it. She had been instructed that he would not get an audience, but he had no guarantee that it was not a person from the Curamiria side. The girl replied that she had no proof, but not all nobles were his enemies. At least the blood of the House of Porf had not yet rotted. They wanted to fight for a just cause, and it was natural for them to think so. The girl wished good luck in this war, and quietly disappeared. Alan clenched his fist and thought that the war had already started. In that case, the guy decided to hurry back to the palace. But when Alan went back, there was no one there. In the middle of the hall, only Amanda was standing with her son, and Alan asked her where everyone else was. Amanda replied that everyone else had gone to ask for help at other houses with whom they had long had good relations. Alan thought they were fools, since there was no one to help them for fear of Dinquido. Everyone understood this perfectly well, but decided to try their luck anyway. The boy suddenly turned to Alan and asked him to teach him the sword in order to fight alongside him. He asked the Lord herself to teach him as if he were being taught by his father. You had earlier ordered them to remain calm, for there was nothing they could do now. The boy cried and said that he too would protect Idonia. He wished to become an excellent knight in order to protect everyone. While Kraju wiped his tears, Alan looked at the boy in silence. Amanda asked the Lord not to be offended, but they too had the same feelings as this child. You and Alan's mother thought the same way. Not only everyone in their house, but all the people of Idonia undoubtedly felt the same way. Amanda thought that everyone wanted to fight for Idonia. Alan had been very kind since childhood and didn't like anyone you hurt, so they were willing to sacrifice themselves for him. In particular, Amanda really liked such a young master and asked him to keep something in mind. All the people of Idonia followed his back and gave support. They too wanted to protect what was dear to them. Alan remembered the words of his late father, who had asked him to make no mistake about what he had to protect. Alan's lips trembled. The boy could barely hold back his tears and agreed with every word they said. Amanda apologized for her intrusive behavior, but Alan said she was wrong. His trembling hands clenched into a fist. Everyone was so determined that Alan understood everything. He was the only one here who wasn't prepared the most, at least because of his personal relationships. He had to protect what was dear to him, but he didn't want to show his face to Leo and the others. He asked his late father to see how he would exert the Lord's willpower. What he looked at and what he wanted to protect was just perfect. Not really looking back at the people he was supposed to be looking at, he wanted to protect them. Alan headed for the exit in a hurry, but Amanda didn't realize where he was going. The boy smiled and replied that he was finally seeing clearly. He asked to let the others know if they came back. No matter what they used, they wanted to protect Idonia together. Along the way, Alan thought that was what Leo was ready for at the time. Alan jumped up on his horse and hurried to his friend. The Lord quickly found himself at Leo's palace and after apologizing went inside. He wanted to meet at least someone, but suddenly he came upon a familiar figure. Leo turned back and saw a concerned Alan in front of him. Alan said that he was just in time, for he wanted to talk to him. In truth, the Cumeria had attacked his province, so he was here. In addition, Lord Kane's allied with His Highness Chardo and received support from Dinquido. His military strength was about 1,000 men against their large army of 3,500 with the support of the pikemen. Alan came to meet the Emperor to stop the war, but it was too late. Alan hoped that Leo was listening to him attentively, for his friend walked forward in silence. Leo asked if that was really all he had come here for. Alan exclaimed that it was a critical situation for Idonia. Plus, at this rate, Idonia would be invaded and many innocent people would be victimized. Alan was sure that Leo had once experienced this suffering too. In other words, he came here to say that their case was deplorable. Alan grabbed Leo's hand and asked him to wait. He didn't realize what that just was. After all, he had come here to meet and ask for his help. The hero snatched back his hand and asked to have proper behavior and manners in such a case. Leo grabbed Alan by his clothes and said that such a face was not like him at all. Leo ordered the guy to finally make up his mind for himself. Leo asked the guy who he was and what he came here for. After that, he let go of Alan's clothes and the Lord silently lowered his head. Alan gave his name and said that he was the Lord of the province of Idonia. Just now he was really disappointed and foolish. He had to prepare himself and fulfill the duties of a lord. Today he came again to meet and ask for a detachment of Alexis knights led by His Highness Leonardo. Alan said that his province of Idonia had been constantly providing support to the detachment of the knights Alexis, and he expected favor. This arrangement went against his will, but the situation was serious. One of the 4 court aristocrats has a relation. In other words, if they supported them in this endeavor, they would certainly attract attention. But by all means, they needed a detachment of Alexis knights. So Alan got down on his knee and presented the request of all the people of Idonia. The Lord bowed to the hero and asked to fight together to save Idonia. Alan did not dare to look into Leo's eyes, and the hero understood the whole situation perfectly. He asked the Earl of Idonia to raise his head. Leo smiled and said that they had been helped by the support of Idonia in the past, so they couldn't help but thank them. Leo promised that they, as a squad of Alexis knights, would do their best to save Idonia. Alan couldn't hold back his tears and asked Leo for forgiveness. Leo opened the doors to the guys' lounge and asked them not to worry about it. After all, they were still friends. Alan was shocked to see a whole army of Leos who had heard their entire conversation. The guys were already looking for their swords, and Shella suggested that they hurry up with their preparations. Shella replied that they would be ready soon, so the Alan could wait a bit. Bauman was even confused and admitted that Lord Alan's younger sister was quite a stern girl. Alan couldn't believe that his sister was really here. Leo smiled and said that she came around noon and asked for help, but there was no way Leo could make a final decision. Leo apologized for his recent behavior, for his little sister had already asked for it. She assumed that Alan would come here and ask to punish the uncomprehending fool. Alan grabbed his head and smiled and said he was just confused. Leo said that he was preparing to firmly accept it. The hero reached out to his friend and told the fool that he was a late arrival. Wiping the remnants of tears, Alan reached out his hand to his friend and apologized. Leo suggested that everyone else proceed to the War Council since Alan herself had finally arrived. Alan mentally turned to his father and thought that maybe he wouldn't see the dream again and asked to watch him this time. Alan was now confident that together with them and all the people of Idonia, they would surely defend their province. On Clodo's calendar, it was now the year 211, the third month of the third day. The following events took place in the main mansion of the province of Alexis. Everything became clear to Leo after what Myria said to herself. Things were getting a little more complicated, but Shella thought that everything was fine and they shouldn't have changed their strategy. Leo warned that they should not underestimate His Highness Chardo, but Shella knew that without him, she could not disregard his success as a prince as well as his intelligence. In fact, she knew that Prince Chardo was commanding an army and going to the battlefield. At least as far as Leo knew, that was completely not the case. Alan admitted that he hadn't heard of it either. Shella believed that this place was their weakness. Knowledge without experience could sometimes dull decisions. Especially a top student like the prince had absolute confidence in his plans, especially if there is a strong patronage. But on the battlefield, things don't go as described in textbooks. Leo thought that for that reason, it couldn't become a serious threat. Alan wanted to ask Shelley about their problems as he could see her excitement. If she said she wasn't worried, she would probably be lying. Alan and Leo looked at her questioningly. Shella explained that among the 3,000 pikemen sent from Dinquido would be the one who commanded them. Leo realized what she was getting at. Alan suggested that this person might be competent as a staff officer. Shella confirmed this and said that it was a high probability. If that was the case, she was confident that he would definitely teach the wisdom of the Prince of Chardo. It all depended on whether the Chardo would willingly listen to him. Shella thought that this person was an important element to worry about. Leo thought that their strategy would be based on that and questioned the strategist. Shella confirmed his hunch and exclaimed that they were not going to lose. So far, it did sound reliable. Alan was proud of their strategist before the Alexis Knight squad. Shella was so proud of herself, flaring her nostrils. Alan consulted with Shella in all seriousness about his next actions. The first thing was to tell the people living along the track to evacuate. Alan was sorry to think that people would have to leave the villages and towns where they had all been born. He replied to Shell that he would make arrangements as soon as possible. But Leo was not sure that Alan had time to talk to the villagers. Alan knew this. Once completed, he would provide help with money and order the tax exemption for the residents of the domain. The lad wanted to provide a guarantee until their lives would be the same. That was exactly what he was going to announce in his own name. Alan was confident that they would agree even if the people were not calm. Shella knew that's what Alan would say, so she wanted to check with him to see if Alan would really be able to spend more money. Alan undoubtedly agreed with her. He jumped to his feet and exclaimed that if he wished, he could buy the world with money. In that case, Shella asked that everyone be instructed to leave while the villagers were evacuating, carrying a minimum amount of food. It was also worth prohibiting the transportation of household goods. As expected, one could not escape with livestock, but only horses were acceptable as they were needed for evacuation. Any items lost as a result of these measures would later be fully compensated to all residents of the possessions. Shella wished she could be promised that. Alan didn't mind making her a promise, but then Keynes and the others would loot as much as they could. He thought that seeing it all in front of them they would be tempted. Leo was in agreement with him on this point. It wouldn't be good if their enemy troops' morale increased. For a moment, the boys were silent, but Shella only grinned. She thought that if their morale rose, it would be to their advantage. Alan and Leo were completely confused. Besides, people's lives and possessions were much more important to be greedy, and running away carrying a lot of household goods was foolish. The enemy troops would catch up and take lives and possessions. This is what the story said, but there was no time to recount it. Alan didn't understand how the Shella managed to parody their enemies, but said it made sense to him. Leo thought that there must be something else besides the facts of the Shella besides keeping the villagers safe. In that case, since they had made up their minds, Shella suggested that they hurry up and send the male horses, and Alan supported her. From here their subsequent strategy would be carried out. Alan asked if it was worth developing their case and Leo undoubtedly agreed with the boys. As Leo thought, Shella was apparently overconfident. Shella suggested calling the plan like a rice cake off the shelf that was poisonous. She called their plan the grand strategy. Leo thought she had a quandary about the name of the strategy, and Alan felt himself getting a little uneasy. Shella coughed and said what she had said in all seriousness. Shella replied that it wasn't a strategy just for them. The future of the entire nation and Idonia was at stake, so she couldn't make it trivial. She only tried to convince the boys to trust her plan. Besides, she didn't understand how they could save this country if they couldn't save one Idonia. She turned to His Highness and Leo agreed with her completely. The guy smirked and asked Alan to trust them with the rest. Alan thanked his friend for his help, for the happiness of all the inhabitants and domains of Idonia, above all for the sake of his dear friend. Surely they will lead Idonia to victory. With these words, Leo extended his fist to Alan. Alan agreed with him and in honor of their friendship, they bumped fists as usual. Shella followed suit and similarly bumped them with her fist. On Claude's calendar it was the year 211, 3rd month 19th day. All further events took place in the province of Idonia in the north central. Chardo and Canes, with an army of Cuamiria, were joined by the pikemen on the southern shore of Lake Ea on the border of the province. Moving south along the tract, finding towns and villages along the way, they repeated the pillaging. 100 cavalrymen were used for reconnaissance, 300 infantrymen were armed with ordinary lances, and 200 archers consisted of volunteer hunters. There were also 3,000 pikemen, forming the nucleus. The total number of the army finally consisted of 3,600 soldiers. All these soldiers were at this moment striving for Idon. One of the lords thought that the camp was more than sufficient to crush the Idonia. Chardo smirked and asked the Keens if he really thought that. The horse-seated Keens laughed and said that it was indeed a climax. The image of His Highness leading the troops looked like a brilliant thing. Lord Keens was already envisioning Alan's grief-stricken face. But, as it was said, even tragedy was beautiful. Chardo slightly admired Alan's actions, for above all, he was thinking of the lives of the people of the Dominions. But Keens was disappointed that the towns and villages became completely empty. But thanks to their belongings and livestock left behind, they had fun in their sinuses and bellies. Lord Keens decided that after the Alan vowed to surrender, they would take all his possessions. The irritating half-breed and his band of knights would be cut off from their source of funds. With one blow, they would destroy 2 birds with 1 stone. Also, Canes thought his father should have considered retiring from business. The enemy lords and their soldiers could only thank Alan. Looking at Canes, all the other infantrymen laughed. Chardo thought it was excellent that their soldiers' spirits were rising. Naturally, it had to be said that for a numerical army in war, this was enough. The morale decisive of victory was quite important. In this respect, the ant acted skillfully on the battlefield, crossing swords with Admaz. If they didn't tangle under her feet, she would surely win. Thinking about it, Chardo smirked. At some point, the legs of Cain's horse began to shake. Cain's fell down along with his horse and the whole army stopped. They were afraid for the Lord and hoped he was not hurt. Cain's horse did not get up and this made the Lord furious. Lord Cain's was offended that he could fall off the horse and kicked the animal in the stomach with all his might. He ordered it to get up and mount, but the horse did not even respond to his cries. Chardo turned to Lord Cain's and suggested that he walk around a bit. Cain's did not understand what he meant. Chardo believed that the reason for the horse's fall was because of the Lord's weight. In addition, the stern Chardo ordered attention to Cain's formation, which was in disarray because of him. Cain's became afraid of the Chardo and apologized to him. Lord Chardo didn't think they should have fooled around like that. Suddenly another horseman appeared from the line of soldiers, who said that Cain's was merely leading an army of 3,000 men. This young rider said that at the request of His Highness, they arrived here immediately. They came from a distant province, and Inquito commanded them. 3,000 pikemen arrived without disturbing the formation in any way. Besides, his experience in battle was evident. The Lord named Torium along with his underlings bowed to His Highness. As expected of a grandfather, he was able to provide his grandson with a good night. Keynes was beyond angry and swung his fist in the air. He shouted after Chardo that apparently his body was getting bigger and bigger. After a while, one of the soldiers alerted His Highness Chardo that they had discovered a village ahead. Chardo replied that it would soon be dark, so this night they would stop there. Along with this, he authorized looting in that village. Chardo looked at Lord Keynes with a smirk and said that there was happy news for him. Lord Keynes pretended that he wasn't interested, but in that case they wouldn't starve anymore. Saying that the fat-bellied lord laughed, he ordered his soldiers to restore the formation. The soldiers asked Lord Keynes about the horse and the lord ordered it to be thrown away. In any case, it was no longer worth using. The soldiers thought it was a great loss, for it would not be able to pull a load. Idonia had left her horses behind, but they were very old. Besides, it was also a mare. The soldiers were anxious to see where they would stop for the night. They wondered what had been left of the belongings there. His partner thought they would have an increase in handcarts and next asked the soldier to carry them on his own. His partner asked him not to talk nonsense and to express himself more precisely. To be more precise, they worked in shifts. Lord Torame decided not to hesitate and approached the emaciated white mare of Lord Keynes. He stabbed the horse's heart with his sword and killed the animal. Of course, they were sorry to kill a useful resource. Torame took out a piece of cloth and wiped the blood off the sword blade with a smug grin. When the Chardo troop reached this village, they exclaimed that it had been worth it. They were delighted with the booty, which obviously would not fit in the cart. A new cart had to be found for the new stuff. Later, the Torame knight went into the house of His Highness Chardo and apologized for his rudeness. Just at that moment, the Chardo, along with Lord Keynes, were feasting at the table and their assistant was melting the fireplace. Torame had a report and Chardo ordered him to speak. It was embarrassing for the knight to say it, but apparently the pace of their march was falling. A disgruntled Lord Keynes jabbed a finger at him and asked the Thoram what he was allowing himself. Drinking clearly not his first glass of wine, Keynes hiccuped at the end of the sentence. Torame explained that the soldiers were weakening from the cause of the large increase in carts. The fat-bellied lord lost his temper and shouted at Torame. In other words, he was telling them to drop the carts. Keynes thought he was a complete moron, for they could take breaks. The knight fell at his feet and apologized for his behavior. Chardo, who was watching them from the side, asked Lord Keynes to stop. He turned to Lord Torama and asked for a full report to him. Keynes blushed involuntarily and the Torame breathed a sigh of relief. Chardo asked to also report everything he sees from now on. They would be at a disadvantage if they missed anything. After all, Chardo was still himself, not someone else. The Torame knight happily agreed with him and moved on to report. During his report, Lord Keynes tisked unhappily and drank half a glass of wine. Considering their problem, Chardo was curious to know how far they had gotten today. Torame explained that judging from the location, they had gone about 10 kilometers. That meant they would be delayed 5 or 6 days to arrive in Idonia. It was embarrassing for the knight to say that, but that was the way it was. But Chardo thought that Alan had not seriously prepared for this and asked Torame's opinion. The knight had exactly the same opinion. A disgruntled Lord Keynes took one look at the knight and thought he was a real sycophant. The famous work of the Eastern Empire valued incredible swiftness, but Chardo thought that it depended on the situation. This time it suited them to advance the campaign in this way, having freedom of action and maintaining morale. If they hurried too much, when they met the enemy army, everyone would be exhausted because they didn't pay attention. The knight was in full agreement with Chardo's doubt. Chardo believed that the Alan could only defeat them by a surprise attack, and thought that he only had to rely on an ambush. Besides, their march was cautious by sending scouts. Therefore, they would surely be able to prevent it. Torame bowed his head contentedly to Chardo and quested his every word. The disgruntled Lord Keynes thought that he too could understand as much. At the moment, His Highness felt that they didn't need cunning, just that they would be careful and watch their step. He was confident that victory would naturally fall into their hands. It seemed to Chardo that his method of action was going by Lord Torame's manuals, but the knight replied that this was not the case at all. He thought it was the right way, according to firm rules. Undoubtedly, this war was suitable for His Highness. Chardo was perfectly calm, if that was what Lord Torame was saying, and suggested in that case that the carts should not be left behind. Lord Keynes was madly delighted at this news and blushed with happiness. However, in view of Lord Torame's concern, they would not increase their booty any further. Chardo asked so-and-so to hand them over to the soldiers and Lord Torame listened to His Highness. This order was quite upsetting to Lord Keynes. This was exactly what Lord Torame had expected from His Highness Chardo. He was going to go without fail and carefully convey his words to the lowest level. Chardo smugly took the glass in his hands and drank from it. His Highness thought it was completely inept, but it was also not bad. During their conversation, a few more soldiers ran in and called out His Highness Chardo with Lord Kane's. They found a refugee camp 2 kilometers ahead. Hearing such news, Lord Kane's nostrils immediately dilated with joy. In other words, he wanted to say that they had delayed their escape. The knight replied that those fools had decided to load full carts with belongings, so they couldn't have gotten far. It became clear to His Highness. He looked at his wine glass and thought about the true nature of the greedy fools from the towns and villages who disobeyed Alan's order. Lord Kane's was already impatient and asked for permission to go there. His Highness placed his glass on the table in silence. He did not mind about their entertainment, but they were no longer to increase the number of carts. Lord Kane's was insanely happy and thanked the Lord for such a decision. Lord Kane's hurried forward and called the equally satisfied soldiers after him. Lord Kane's was already drooling at the thought that he would be able to get himself a woman. Chardo smirked at him. He didn't think there were beautiful girls in such a backwater and asked Lord Torame for his opinion. The knight was sure there would be no woman here worthy of His Highness's eyes. Chardo raised his glass again and looked at Lord Torame with a smirk. Outside, they could already hear the screams of the soldiers and the woman asking for her release. Lord Chardo was thinking about something with a smile. He said that Lord Kane's and the others were having too much fun outside. He was extremely tired, so he suggested that Lord Torama should go. With his strained smile, the knight apologized for the disturbance and left His Highness's house. Previously, this person was assigned the title of Uncaught Fox given his abilities. The grandfather believed that his grandson grew up in a hothouse with no war experience, and therefore Lord Torame had to penetrate the shadow, acting as a commander and win a complete victory. Grandfather Chardo thought that this would be easy for him as Torame was battle-hardened and had spent half his life at the front. Lord clearly had no intention of becoming some kind of babysitter for an inexperienced boy, and thought that Grandpa was worrying for nothing. He also feared the rumors that the prince was a flatterer, but Lord Torama should have noticed that Chardo was quite good for a boy. With these thoughts, he opened the doors to his room, where he was greeted by the rest of the squad. His boys praised the commander for a good job, but the Lord replied that he was no longer the commander. One of the soldiers apologized, for he could not get rid of the habit. They had not yet fully realized that they were attendants serving a good knight. The third drinking man, who was nibbling on a bone, thought that they couldn't even eat in peace. The boys became too noisy and Lord Torame ordered them to be quiet. One of the bald soldiers smirked and suggested that they weren't going to quiet down. Lord Torame smirked and said that he really had better listen to their chatter. The guys wanted to know how things really went for him. Lord Torame sat down directly on the table and took a meat ham. From what he understood, the soldiers were asking about their chances of winning this war. Taking a big bite, the Lord smirked and said that at least he didn't see the necessary conditions for defeat. Meanwhile, Leo and his team had set up in a town 20 kilometers south of Idonia. A girl ran inside the room and exclaimed to His Majesty that she was just fine. Shella thought that perhaps they could experience the atmosphere of a wedding trip if they spent the night here together. Leo asked her about an appropriate groom, and the girl puffed up her cheeks. Shella pounded Leo's back with her small fists and called him a fool. She thought His Highness was really unfriendly and he didn't need to be that kind of person. Still, Shella wasn't going to give up. Leo wanted to check with the Shella about the situation, because the enemy army even at this time would surely invade Idonia. Shella sighed sadly and thought that Leo was truly a serious person. She said that Baumansan and the others dressed as travelers talked about finishing the gathering by the end of the 5th day. For the other plan that Alan Sama and Myryu are engaged in, they will need more time to prepare. In this case, all they had to do was wait for them. Leo was still worried, but the girl asked him to calm down. Besides, this was her strategy and it was by all means more important. Shella pointed her finger at His Highness and reminded him of the legends and lore. The hero didn't understand what she meant by saying that her strategy was more important. On Claude's calendar, it was the 211th year, the 3rd month, the 20th day. The Chardo army continued the march, given Torame's restlessness. It looked like yesterday definitely Lord Kane's and the others were able to have some fun. Everyone was grateful for His Highness's permission, and it was a time when everyone was thirsty for blood and passion. It seemed to Lord Chardo that Kane's was having the most fun, but it didn't matter now. Looking at the way Lord Kane's tied the nearly naked girl to his horse, Chardo hoped he wouldn't slow them down. But Kane's grinned and told him not to worry about it. Even though her thin legs were trembling, Kane's ordered her to step faster. He said that he left her life solely out of his kindness, so she should be grateful to him. Looking at the rag-clothed girl resisting and struggling to move behind him, the Lord blushed with pleasure. Her breasts were bouncing following her movements and Kane's kept glancing at it. Drooling over her, the Lord said that tonight he would feel his lover properly. The girl was hurt and disgusted to hear such a thing said to her. The captive pressed her lips together. All the other soldiers and Lord Torame meanwhile walked behind. One of the Torame soldiers whispered that neither the nobles nor the imperial family had changed at all. They were all from the same field of berries, but there are only two types of people. The man didn't understand what Lord Torame meant. The Lord replied that here was a well-paid lord and a tart lord. In this, Dinquodo was extremely good. They were brave descendants. One of the soldiers grinned and replied that they would serve them sincerely. Lord Torame warned the Scotty archer. He pointed to the left front into the thicket at the top of the hill. The Scotty understood, drew his bow, and let loose an arrow in the given direction. His arrow almost hit an enemy horse. The squad that was on the hill hurried to leave as quickly as possible. The enemy squad's partner replied that their archer was slanted. Scotty shouted that he was just short of alcohol and wine. The bald soldier thought they should have been pursued, but the Lord replied that everything was fine. There could be enemy positions waiting for them here, but this way they would break formation in vain. He thought it was an ambush, but perhaps it was a simple reconnaissance. It was a small problem if even they could find out about their march. Rather, the approach of a large army should have fueled the enemy's anxiety. Nevertheless, it seemed to the Lord that their atmosphere was heating up. It was quite strange that they had come here, but they didn't know when their enemies would take countermeasures. As always, the soldiers considered their lord to be a reliable and awesome commander. One of the soldiers told his partner that he, unlike him, was as strange as ever. From the beginning, they were mercenaries and still survived. Due to his ability to assume danger, Lord Torame became an incomparable commander. Lord Torame remained an uncaught fox. He had not yet been caught by anyone and was a monstrous fox that appears in ancient myths, and attacked as well as tormented people. The bald soldier thought again that this undoubtedly referred to this man. The 21st day of the 3rd month came. Then came the 22nd day. While Keynes ate the apple and sat on his horse, his captive continued to walk barefoot on the ground. It was the same on the 23rd day. The march of the Chardo army continued, and it seemed strange to Lord Tarama that everything was going on without incident. On the 24th day afternoon they reached a place about 8 kilometers north of the provincial capital. Meanwhile, 10,000 refugees and residents were holed up in a castle in the province of Idonia. Chardo ordered to bypass this forest from the west and head towards Idonia. He also ordered scouts to go ahead and check the forest. Lord Keynes thought that they should have gone straight through the forest along the path, as it would be much faster. Chardo smirked and said that it was super foolish to put such a large army on a narrow path. The large army only lived when deploying battle positions in the narrow forests. The difference in military power made no sense, and it was only an advantage to the enemies. Besides, he was going to set up camp in a place too close to Idon. They were better off heading to the vicinity of the northwest forest, and there they would stop their march. Lord Keynes thought this was strange, despite the fact that the provincial capital was right in front of his nose. Chardo replied that they had a great advantage, and to them impatience was their worst enemy. It would be best to quietly resume the march tomorrow. Chardo asked Lord Torame for his opinion, and Torame agreed with his words. As he thought, this man was not ruining a possible relationship in every sense. Chardo asked Lord Keynes to remember that on the battlefield, the most patient and persistent people were called great generals. It was more than just fortune. Lord Torame smirked and thought that he had the true character of a king. Lord Keynes grudgingly creased his face. He had no choice but to agree with Chardo. Hearing his captive make a sound, the Lord pulled the rope and exclaimed that she had just grinned. Lord Torame thought the same of Lord Keynes. He thought that this pig was an example of an insufferable nobleman who was selfishly raised and saw no limits. Lord Torame dared to tell His Highness that he had a slight uneasiness. Chardo asked him not to be shy and to speak up. It seemed strange to Lord Torame that Count Idonia had not hindered them at all so far and suggested that he might be up to something. Count Keynes laughed. He was absolutely certain that it was Count Alan who had clearly done nothing. It was simply impossible for Alan. If he opposed them, he would be dealing with a large army. Lord Keynes sat that the only thing they were going to do was to sit locked up like a tortoise in Idonia. But even if they were going to be cooped up, without strong fortress walls, without allies or nobles, it seemed strange to Tarama. He assumed that if they surrounded the provincial capital, containing more than 10,000 refugees, they could easily exploit the starvation blockade. Alan's troops would certainly not win in such a situation. Torame asked Chardo for his opinion, but it seemed natural to Chardo, for he was preparing for a sure victory. Not at all. Lord Torame was not going to play with words. They absolutely could not win, but they still took no action. This in itself was strange, so Lord Torame had a kind of bad feeling. Keynes couldn't stand it and shouted that they were simply incapable of it. There were no fools trembling in vain fear, magnifying their enemy in their own way. If this was indeed the case, then Lord Torame would be only too glad. While the lords were pondering this, scouts came out of the forest and called out to His Highness Chardo. The scouts informed them that no ambushes or traps had been found in the forest. Chardo replied that this was good and thought that these surroundings suited them. Chardo ordered the march to cease and prepare camp. The soldiers accepted His Highness's order and dismounted. Lord Keynes asked His Highness if he was really satisfied with such a place. Lord Chardo thought that this place was the best. Lord Keynes did not understand anything at all, but regardless, he was sure that this was the end for Idonia. Keynes touched the girl's head and grinned, saying that he would also take his time to have fun today. He thought the captive was fine with it, but the girl only rewarded him with a despairing look. A soldier reported to Chardo that a spy had arrived with a report. Chardo ordered him to be brought here. The speaker bowed to Chardo's horse and the lord ordered him to tell him the situation in Idonia. According to the scout, the Earl of Idonia appeared before the inhabitants day after day, appealing for calm, so they showed no signs of increasing morale. Lord Keynes put his fat arm around the captive's body and grinned, suggesting that her lord was a chump. The troops, meanwhile, were whispering among themselves. One of the soldiers said that the same was true of their enemy soldiers. Anyway, there were too many refugees and their concern finally spread to the soldiers. Chardo smirked and said that it was just a cheap feeling for the villagers. The lord suggested that they might be showing signs of receiving reinforcements at the moment, but the reporter replied that this had not been seen. Chardo seemed amused that the Allen had not received support from the Knights of Alexis. Judging from this, Leonard appeared to be an unexpectedly heartless man. Keynes laughed out loud and exclaimed that this was the reason why he was a half-blood. He probably didn't have the pride of the imperial family. Only the speaker was bothered by one thing that alerted Chardo. His eyebrows furrowed and he ordered to speak. The fact is that several hundred horses and refugees escaped. The soldiers took everyone in a row. They galloped back and forth along the tract. For many days they repeated this simulation as if they were practicing their riding. Chardo asked Lord Torame for his opinion. Torame thought it was not important. Even though they had several hundred horses, in his humble opinion, they could try to make an improvised cavalry. It is said that a war horse is trained and accustomed to war for many years. A mediocre horse was no good. It would be frightened of the battlefield, and people probably didn't know that. Chardo felt that the people in Idonia were completely incompetent at this, but it seemed to Chardo that there did appear to be a connection here. Lord Torame looked questioningly at Chardo. His Highness replied that their enemies had organized the gathering of horses inside the province along with the evacuation of the inhabitants. If this was true, it made sense to create a cavalry unit. To realize this, they immediately abandoned livestock and household goods. Ironically, they were involved in this, and in a way they helped the enemy. If everything was correct, then Chardo was certain that the Allen would attack early in the morning or at night. This was the worst possible plan for them. In that case, Chardo exclaimed that their army would take action against this move. First of all, they would double the usual reconnaissance and double the night guard. The soldiers would take turns to carry the guard and see that their enemies did not gather to go around them. It was also worth watching mainly the western side of the forest. Chardo asked not to worry about the side of the tract. Chardo turned to the captive Keynes and asked her about how to get through the forest at night. The Keynes laughed and replied that going through the forest at night was rather foolish. It was tantamount to going to certain death. Chardo coldly replied that he was not asking the Lord about that. Keynes glanced at the silent girl, but she apparently wasn't going to say anything to them. Chardo ordered her to answer him and Lord Keynes grabbed her head sharply. The captive replied that no one was to enter the forest at night or the huge monsters would destroy and eat their bodies and they would sleep forever. Such words alarmed the troop. Even Keynes became uneasy, whereupon he let go of the captive's head. In other words, the reason even the child knew how terribly sacred the place was at night in the forest. Then Chardo felt that it was more effective to pay close attention to the detour. If they had more trouble, Chardo asked Lord Torame to point it out. But Torame bowed and replied that he had no point. In that case, Chardo asked him to tell the soldiers that tomorrow they would depart at sunrise, regardless of whether or not there would be a night attack. Chardo ordered the guard to be posted and to rest immediately. He allowed the detachment to drink wine as well. Idonia had acted violently for years, so their army wished to repay them. The soldiers with high morale shouted and raised their hands in the air. All the lords and their soldiers were in anticipation. The girl alone could barely hold back her tears. Lord Torame was only convinced that the prince was a true model for countermeasures. Chardo clearly had no flaws whatsoever. Lord Torame was absolutely certain that this battle would be a winnable battle for them. However, he was not left with that strange feeling. Torium realized that something was going on here. As the sun began to set and it began to darken rapidly outside, the enemies set up their camp. Some of the soldiers went on guard duty while the rest of them fell asleep. Lord Chardo also decided to rest and closed his eyes with a smile on his face. Meanwhile, the bound naked girl cried and prayed only that they would all be eaten by the very monsters of the forests. While Lord Torium was resting in his chamber, he noticed that the mug on his table began to barely ripple. It seemed strange to him. When Torium opened his eyes, he could already hear the clatter of hooves approaching the camp. They were black troops that were rapidly approaching them. Their helmets looked like black skulls and were terrifying. The Chardo troops began to shout and ordered their allies to flee from here as fast as possible. Everything happened so fast that no one realized what was wrong. The soldiers that were knocked off their feet tried to figure out what was wrong. The frightened allies ordered the guy to run away if he didn't want to die. They noticed a black army appearing out of the dark forest and their helmets looked like skulls. One of the soldiers cried out in terror that a forest demon had appeared from the side of the tract. The second soldier didn't understand what his partner was talking about and assumed that they were just attacked by the enemy. But the guy was so scared that he couldn't say for sure. The only thing he could say was that the forest monster looked like a black horse, and the black knight that sat on the horse was like a monster and was waving a monstrously large halberd. The frightened boy turned back and tears came to his eyes. He had no doubt that they had attracted the attention of the god of death. The Black Knight cut the soldier's body in half and ordered his troops to attack. No one knew that Leonardo's great halberd weighed more than 24 kilograms. An ordinary man would never have been able to handle such an iron ingot. By engaging in self-observation of the movement of the muscles of the body, it made it possible to continuously temper the workings of the blood. No one had taught Leo such an art. It was only by his own diligence and acumen that he mastered this martial art. It was the beauty of a wild beast, like the art of a lion. The enemy squad was so frightened that they fled. The remaining members of the Leo troop ordered their troops to follow His Highness. One of the enemy soldiers tisked unhappily and ordered them to get out of the way. He didn't believe it was a monster and ordered the cowards to watch carefully. He was the Ordinarian of the Curumeria army who obviously wouldn't be afraid of such a thing. The Ordinarian ordered the enemy to approach him and prepared to attack. Leonard was thinking of his friend and his friend's hometown at the time. There was no hesitation in his muscles and halberd. With one stroke he cut off the Ordinarian's head. Looking at his friend Leo's back, Alan was able to think about something again. He remembered what strength and readiness were. Ever since he was a child, Leo had told him that if he couldn't protect himself, he couldn't protect others. At the time, Alan hesitated to answer. Leo asked the kid who he was and what he came here for. Leo asked him not to worry about him since they were friends. Alan appreciated that Leo reached out to him. Shella had told him earlier that this strategy wasn't just for them. The future of all the people of Idonia was at stake here. Alana couldn't make it trivial, and even putting his life on the line, there were comrades who would be able to take care in his homeland. At the time, Alana's reins wanted to slip down, but now he could hold them tightly again. Alan shouted and ordered the squad to move to the attack. At this moment he was truly grateful to Leo for everything. Earlier, about 2 hours ago, something happened in Idon. Alan brought the cattle to a man and asked him to take care of them. The man replied that as the owner of the farm it was all he could do. They prepared 500 spare horses for the riders and that was the end of their training. All Alan had to do was trust the others and wait. Their strategy was a night attack. Shella assumed that the belongings and livestock left behind the other day would fall into the hands of the enemy march. Thus, they would prolong their preparation period. In addition, they needed a surprise attack strategy. Shella thought that they would be able to find out the position of the enemy army. According to the scouts' accounts of the speed of the march, their enemies were marching approximately 8.5 kilometers a day. Given the terrain around the provincial capital and the superiority of His Highness Chardo, one could assume a halt of the Chardo army for the night on the 24th day. But if that was the case, Alan asked what they would do with tired horses at such a distance from the city. Shella replied that Alan had requisitioned horses from the refugees and asked Alan to train them to run on the tract. She suggested that they use these horses as replacements and then they could attack at night by going through the night forest. Alan was horrified and exclaimed that if they entered the forest at night they would be chewed to death. Alan was sure that the Knights of Alexis would be opposed. It was natural that the enemy side was also watching everything but the forest road. This surprise attack wouldn't be successful if they didn't pass through the night forest. Well, as Alan said to herself, the problem was this place. It was forbidden to enter the night forest and the fear of this superstition was instilled from childhood. It was also a form of legend and lore. but it could also include a troop of knights Alexis. They were to erase from memory that it was not fitting to kill an enemy through the night forest. Leo assumed the girl had some sort of plan, and she nodded approvingly. They should have used faith against them, an eye for an eye. It was legends and lore for legends and lore. They would ask Big Sister Dahlia to arrange one production, having with them an excellent actress in production. They will present a baptism from the goddess Nukta. By doing so, they will erase the fear regarding the night forest from their minds. On the night of the 24th, Alan herself will be waiting in the Idon along with the spare horses. Shella asked to be sure to show everyone a miracle, demonstrating her determination to go through the woods. Before Alan left, the farmer addressed the Lord and begged his pardon. He hoped that the people with Idonia would be okay. The man was really scared and worried about it. Alan smiled and replied that before he came here, everyone had exactly the same faces. The man wanted to apologize, but Alan replied that it was okay. The enemy was already approaching and the concern was well understood by them. Alan thought that he had also caught up with his father's back a little, but there was still half of the way to go. They had refugees who had disobeyed the edict, and they had been victimized. Alan believed that the reason was his lack of character, but nevertheless, he still had a friend and family who believed in the Lord, supported and cooperated in this war, and they also had the residents of the Dominions. Therefore, Alan wanted to promise them they would surely win tomorrow and see with the rising sun a manly face filled with their hope. The farmer was moved by Lord Alan's speech. In addition, they did not fear the god because their ally was the strongest unit of knights. It looked like the strategy of the Shella was successful. Alexis' squad of knights is of course led by the Blood Prince who was the spawn of darkness. Leo's army was going to hurry up and replace the horses. They needed to tie them up tightly at the back. They also had time to linger and rest for a while. Alan told Leo that during these 2 years he kept imagining rushing across the battlefield with them. But under such circumstances, it performed really embarrassing. Leo smiled and replied that they would kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Alan laughed and agreed with Leo. Before the fight, they pounded each other's fists as usual. Alan also wanted to make sure their Alexis squad made a decision and thanked them in advance. Bauman didn't understand what he was talking about since it was obvious. Because of the war 3 years ago, they didn't fear the 4-court aristocrats. The previous Earl of Idonia had helped them, and Alan had fought alongside them. As knights, it was considered a disgrace for them not to respond to this righteousness. Besides, Alan supported them with his ambition, and if they went with his highness, they would not be afraid of the monsters in the forest. His comrade didn't understand what his friend was talking about. He thought that the fellow would be the very first to be frightened and run away. What worried the farmer was that they were really going to drive through the forest at night. Black Army Alexis looked questioningly at the farmer. Bauman asked the master not to worry. They could not hide the fact that there was a blessing of darkness of the messenger of the goddess of the night here. Before they all came here, they saw the miracle of the city. At the sight of the divine beauty of the goddess of Nukta, the soldiers' hair stood on end. The goddess of darkness appeared before their eyes and blessed them. She declared that she had complete trust in the man named Leonardo. She said that all over the world, the entire family of night and darkness would be supporters of the Blood Prince, and he could have no doubts and no fear of the dark. In other words, it would be easy for them to pass through the night forest. Bauman put a question to his highness. Leo looked back at the farmer with a horrified look. He introduced himself as the messenger of the goddess of the night and asked him to continue believing him. The farmer felt a little uneasy. One of Alexis' knights wanted to make sure his host was all right. His reaction was not surprising. Alan thought it would be gold for acting, but Leo asked him to be quiet. In addition, Scheller relayed that Big Sister Dahlia would later receive payment with a huge thank you from Alan. Alan laughed. Together with Leo, he put on his helmet and said that there was nothing he could do about it. Their squad prepared to depart. Leo got on the Zanzas and ordered everyone to follow him. The farmer looked after them and joined the rest of the people in asking for the protection of the Idonia. Alan had no doubt that they would win. Their horses galloped toward the dark forest. The farmer escorted the knights with a look and asked the darkness to bless them. Thus events returned to the present 2 hours after their departure. Leo and Alan's squad was already rushing through the forest and preparing to advance on the enemy. Alan kept his eyes on Leo, who was leading them. His friend's big back gave him courage. Alan shouted that their advance party was being led by the Blood Prince, so they had nothing to fear. Everyone else supported him and boosted their morale. Leo smiled after looking at Alan. Thus they soon attacked the enemy unit. The enemies had never heard of the squad of riders wearing skulls. The horses of this troop stomped straight at the men, and the enemies mistook them for a monster. They didn't understand where this sudden attack was coming from and assumed it was Idonia soldiers. Some frightened soldiers asked the allies to prepare as quickly as possible. No sooner had one of the soldiers turned his head than he saw a huge black horse in front of him, which struck him with its front hooves. The rider on the horse finished off the enemy and also chopped up several other men at once. One of the frightened archers ordered the unclean thing to die and let an arrow fly at the Leo. Alan was afraid for the Leo and called out to him. Leo managed to catch the arrow on the move and hurled it back at the archer. The wounded archer cried out in pain and lost consciousness. Alan smiled and thought about the fact that the Leo was still impressing him. Ahead of them, the pikemen were already waiting for them, and Alan asked Leo to look ahead. As expected of the best, they had already had time to line up. Leo called out to his entire squad and ordered them forward. Leo met the enemy first and chopped their sharp spears with his halberd. Alan exclaimed that His Highness had cleared their path and they could continue to cut in. The Black Riders continued to push through the enemy, and the frightened enemy soldiers demanded that they stay back. As the battle simmered in the center of the camp, a puzzled Keynes cautiously peered out of his tent. Keynes didn't realize what was going on and looked around. There were absolutely no soldiers here, and Keynes called out to the guard. Lord Keynes was furious that everyone had left him and fled. He couldn't find anyone, so he decided he had to do something. Keynes fell to his knees and asked why no one was answering him. He gave the order as the next count of the Curamiria. The bewildered count called out His Highness Chardo as suddenly someone from behind pushed him and Keynes fell to the ground. Turning around, he saw a naked bound commoner in front of him. Keynes was furious, not understanding how she dared to do this. The girl looked at the Earl with disdain. The Earl hit her with all his might in the face and ordered her not to look down on him. The wounded girl fell on the grass and blood came from her temple. Looking at the fallen captive, the Count drew his sword and gritted his teeth and approached her. Keynes heard the screams already approaching in his direction and thought that he too needed to escape as soon as possible. Keynes smirked as he looked at the wounded girl and thought he could use her. He hid in the tent, covering the girl's mouth with his hand. Judging from the squad of riders and the turtles, Lord Alan had gotten outside support after all. Lord Keynes ordered the girl to keep quiet, for if they could, they would survive. He was sure that these were not bad conditions for her. Keynes warned that the refugees who disobeyed the order had themselves to blame, just like the nobles. He felt that they could not help weak people like her. But on the other hand, she had to thank him for still being alive. The desperate girl bit the Lord's hand and Keynes had to let her go. In pain, the Keynes grabbed his arm and the captive girl fell to the ground. She was able to manage to call for help, but her screams were apparently interrupted by the sounds of hooves and the cries of soldiers. The enraged Lord roughly grabbed the girl's legs and threatened to kill her. But at that moment an Alan burst into the tent and cut off Keynes' right hand. Keynes fell to the ground, writhing in pain and grasping at his severed limb. Alan pointed his sword at the Lord and told him that he would never lay a finger on the people of his domain again.